Hello everyone. Hope that everyone is doing well. So yeah, for today, I thought since I couldn't really stream yesterday. I was like busy. I was doing a lot of stuff. But I did want to again. I want to get good at co-working streams, so then that way I won't feel like, oh, I can't do them right. Because I keep feeling like I usually prefer to, like discuss, right? Like I think to me that's kind of like a central thing, right? Is like the ability to discuss and stuff. So I was thinking that, I wanted to focus on co-working first, and then perhaps go into, oh, this light is so bright. Sorry, I changed the colors on them, and for some reason, I guess I'm, one of them must have been set to like, okay, we have that one. There we go. Much better. Much better. I was like, oh no, I'm so used to having like colored lighting. I switched it to blue, but I don't know why I decided to go like like super cold white. But anyway, yeah. So for today, that's kind of what I wanted to do for a little bit, was just co-stream, because I am starting a little bit earlier than I normally would. But that's because, again, I want to focus on co-streaming and getting like used to doing that. But of course, I know that there are people much more better at co-streaming, at co-working than I am. So like, like Levelhead, etc. So again, like, the only thing I would ask is, of course, you be patient, because I know that like I will end up talking soon, right? It might not be like right now that I'm talking about a specific subject, but trust me, like, I mean, like I've already said, like this room is just books everywhere, right? So, there's a lot that we could get into in our discussions for today. So that's totally fine. But yeah, first I want to at least try to finish some writing, and that's kind of my goal for today, is like actually getting writing done while streaming, because I honestly feel like that's something that's very difficult to do for me personally. I mean, one, ADHD, just does not, right, like that executive dysfunction, and as well as other things, right? But also like when it comes to like my own working style, is I'm so used to being, hyper focused, right? Like that's one of the things. It's like that's why, like, when I read books, it's like there are books that I will read and I'm just like sitting there and I'm just like completely paying attention to that, and it doesn't matter what's happening in the rest of the world, right? I have that hyper focus of ADHD, but regardless, I did put some more books on Throne, but don't worry about like the ones that I recently put in. Again, this book right here, it's like, if you would really like to help me, you can always go to my Throne. Oh wait, sorry. You can always go to my Throne and help me out with my research, because again, that's what I'm doing this summer, and it doesn't pay, right? Like it's not like I get paid for the book or for anything like that. Like academic books they give you a pittance anyway, and that's if they even decide to, they always find a way to keep as much of that as possible. So I guess my whole thing is, if you would like to help me most directly, either go to my Throne and help me get the books that are in that gift category of like books for my research, because they come in a variety of like. I know I really dislike having to like advertise. Hi, Miss Frizzle. It's so good to see you. Also, I know I probably showed you the new emoji, but I'm so happy about it. It's great to see you too. It's great to see you too. Yeah, right now I'm just, thank you. Chromatic Mage made it for me, and I am so grateful to them for what they did. Because they've seen the blanket that my mom made for me, right? Thank you. Aw, that's so sweet. But yeah, I wanted to try co-working. Like I really want to get good at it, kind of like how Levelhead is for the most, is really good at it, and other people too, because I just really need to get used to it, right? Like that way I can stream, because like yesterday I couldn't stream. There was like no way I could stream. I had too much to do. But like I really, really want to be more consistent, I guess. Like I don't want to have to feel like, oh, I can't stream because I'm doing work, right? Especially if I'm just gonna stay like here at home, and I could just do the work here, because I honestly don't want to go outside. Like it's really hot. At least, I mean, for me, I get hot really easily. And I hate driving. So and I live in LA, so it's like it's always hot. It's always warm. It's always sunny, and you have to drive everywhere, and I hate it. So I mean, like besides that, I love LA. Right? Like I like yeah. Like I just don't understand why. I was actually considering going over this new channel that I was watching that's like talking about how like in the Netherlands, I think it was like their biggest street that they have in Amsterdam, right? That they're just like, oh, like why don't we just make it for pedestrians and bikes, right? And then they did that, and then like people instead just because there's so much other forms of public transportation that like it didn't actually like do the horrible thing that like particularly Republicans are always trying to say is going to happen, right? They're like, oh, if we build a thing, like I know like in LA, like there's always this view that like, oh, if you come from certain lines of the metro, of the light rail, it's like, oh, you must come from like the ghetto or whatever. I mean, this is kind of how I grew up. And so it's always been like, oh, like if you live on this station of the green line or the blue line, right? It's like it's supposed to be like reflective of your class and racial status too. It's really strange, and I don't know if Miss Anita Bump, who sometimes comes into chat, feels that way or has ever noticed that, but I've felt that before. Where like if I say, oh, I took the blue line from its terminus all the way to here, it makes me feel like people are judging me for some reason. I don't know. It's really weird. And then I hate when people tell me, well, I mean, you could have just drove here. I'm like, I hate driving. Like, I don't think you understand what I mean. I don't think you understand the word hate and driving. Like, those two things. I hate driving. Like, the idea of getting into a car and having to drive and get stuck in traffic for, like, literally hours just to sit down at the library. See, this is why I want to do co-working streams, because I'd rather be here and co-working with you, especially like my colleagues, right? And my friends, of course, and my my viewers, etc. I'd rather do that than be in some library where nobody's wearing a mask, nobody all of that stuff. Hello, Ferret King, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for the gift sub, by the way. I was like, oh my gosh. I was so happy when I saw that. Yeah, it's just way more comfortable, and then I don't have to be worrying about my puppies, right? Because I have, because I just got so my youngest puppy just turned a year old, on July 1st. June 30th, and then my eldest pupper, she had her birthday the next day. Like they were born and so I like gave them treats and everything, but like I also don't, especially because the neighborhood I live in is one where it's like as soon as people had any license to shoot fireworks in the air, they started to do that to such an effect that like I was just like I literally was outside, just like outside on the like area right here, and like behind the building, right? And there was this one firework that went off, and I was like, I don't even know if that was a firework, because I swear I didn't see anything visible, right? I was like, what was that? Like it was like that line of like, is it, because that's the thing, like my whole life it's always been like we don't go out on the 4th of July or whatever, for many reasons, but one of them is because like the fact that shootings do go up for this holiday, right? Because you kind of can't tell sometimes whether it's yeah, exactly. And so I was just like, like I don't know what I just heard, but like it like something viscerally like inside of me was like, oh, go away, like I was just like, just go back inside, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna go back inside. I'm not gonna deal with this any longer because I was taking my puppies out to like, so that way they could like be in the little grassy area that we have right here, and yeah, no, it didn't. Like, it was just scaring them, so I was just like, yeah, I'll just stay in here. But I know that people this morning were firing off fireworks, and I'm like, come on, like, like, it's all, like, if it was last night, that's one thing, right? Like, I know people do that. I'm personally not a big fan of fireworks myself, but, I also saw someone playing this video of this person where they put, like, a Roman candle, I think, that looked kind of like a teddy bear or something, or like Pooh Bear or something, or Winnie the Pooh, I guess, and they had it in their house, like inside their house, inside their mother's house, actually, as I later came to find out, and they're like in the room, like setting it off, and then they get freaked out when it starts shooting everyone. I'm like, well, what did you think was gonna happen, And like, I don't know, it was just, to me, I was just like so confused. Yeah, I was like literally like someone's filming this person, or rather it's being filmed, right? Like, they are not filming it, someone is filming them, or or the camera's placed so that they can be filmed. You see on the bed, right, like on their bed, that there's like fireworks, right? And at first it looks to me like it's like almost like it looks kind of like a stuffed animal, but it's not, right? It's like that soft cardboard to, that way it's more malleable to shape it. And then he like lights it, and it's like going off, right in the house, and like the roof is not that like the ceiling is not that high, like it'd be, I'm not saying get hammered and light the house, pretty much. I mean, like, that's like what happens, like everything, like, I kid you not, there actually is a house that's by my friend's house, which is like a few neighborhoods down, that like they legit were like, why don't we deep fry turkey? And they're like, and everybody had told them, like, if you're gonna deep fry anything, usually people do it in pieces, right? Like, you don't just stick the whole thing in there, right? You cut it in pieces and blah blah blah, and they didn't listen. And now every time I drive, and this is like, technically it's in another like city within like the LA area, like every time I drive to my friend's house, I have to pass by that house, and it's just like, the people don't live there, it has the fence around it, like it's condemned, right? Look at my house as your warning not to set off fireworks in your chimney. Then that had to be oh my gosh. Well, yeah, I know that you can deep fry turkeys, but, and that you could do the whole thing, right? Technically speaking. But these are people who have never had those, like, never done that before. So everyone was like, why don't you do pieces, right? Like deep fry or whatever, pan fry or whatever you wanted to do, just do it in pieces, right? So then that way you can see if you like it first, right? Like, because why would you do that if you don't necessarily like the whole turkey, right? Like, my family has never really liked turkey. I don't know, it's just this weird, like, family thing. Like, my parents never liked it. But yeah, and it's gonna be super dry, exactly, especially because, like, you can't do any basting and anything. YouTube is full of whole turkey fryer fails. Yeah, it's so dangerous. This is why these people were being advised by their neighborhood, right? Because, like, this shows how my neighborhood and the neighborhoods that I lived in are very different, because, like, everything is a collective concern, right? Like, other people are like, if you need food, let us know. That way we can, come help you, right? I mean, it's not perfect, right? It's not utopian in any way, but it's rather that, like, there is a shared concern because, we're all here, right? Like, together. But yeah, turkey is mid. I mean, like, I've had it, and I've had it the American way, so to speak, like, like carved with mashed potatoes and dressing and all of that stuff. But I just don't really see the it doesn't really. I'm just like, okay, like, now I've had guajolote, which means turkey in Nahuatl, but also in Spanish, and they use that in making certain types of mole, and because of the way how the meat is, right, it means that they're able to like add in different like a different flavor profile than like chicken, right? And so then they're able to make it so that it's really juicy, right? Like with all of the added ingredients and everything, and cook it in a specific way. And then they will make mole out of it, right? Which involves them having to mix in a lot of things. And usually this is where they will put like all of these spices, right? In fact, that's why a lot of people often compare mole to curry, right? Because there's a lot of spices and it's this kind of thick sauce on top of it. But yeah. Well, yeah, like even like the turkey legs. I mean, at the Ren Fair, they're so expensive. You know what I mean? I remember when at Disneyland, they were like $20 for one, and I'm like, what? Like outside at like Albertsons or at Ralph's, they're like, what? Ralph's they're like $8.99. You know the one that's like the 2-pack, right? Where they're already smoked and everything, right? You just have to heat them up in the oven. Like that one, I've seen it on sale for $8.99. But again, I'm not a big turkey fan, so like, but I also know bacon wrapped turkey legs fried in butter. No, I cannot. I'm sorry. I've actually had deep fried butter because my friend was like obsessed with it when we went to where's that fairground where they have that fair. It's like it's going towards downtown LA. I just don't remember where it is. Have you ever had fried Oreos? I don't know. Maybe. It depends, because once you go back a certain amount of years, then that's when I was Hasidic, and so Oreos back then were not like considered kosher enough for me to eat back in the day. So it depends. Like if it happened a while ago, I don't know, because like I've never really gone to a lot of the like fairs that are like that, like the big carnivals and stuff, because I mean, I know Anita knows that there are tons of those things all over LA. I'm just trying to think of the one that's going towards Anaheim. It's like near Buena Park, right? But it's big. It's like an actual like event every year. I just can't remember what it's called. But anyway, the State Fair of Texas has deep fried Dr. Pepper. Oh my gosh, that just sounds. Cocaine is kosher for Passover. I mean, whatever you need. I have celiac disease and thus have no reason to visit a state fair ever again. Oh, see, no, like, I get that. And that's why, like, my friend, a colleague of mine, actually, they also suffer from celiac disease, and they spoke to me about, like, how because the kosher laws are so restrictive, right, or make it so that people have to say or disclose much more of what's in the product, right? That's why they started eating kosher foods, right? Because then they have to say, oh, this has gluten, because they have to disclose that for kosher reasons, right? Because you can't mix certain things together. So that's how that happened. But it just happened to be that that they. Do you remember the controversy with Hebrew National a few years ago? Well, I know this. Hebrew National is not considered kosher for like Hasidic Jew. Yeah, it's not kosher. They just put a K there for some reason, but it's not kosher. It's not kosher at all. As much as people like to say it is, but it's not. Like I remember when I was again a Hasidic Jew that. Like that was you never had that. Aw, hi Lexi, it's so good to see you. Thank you. You're so sweet. Yeah, like that's always been a big problem, and my grandfather was very thank you. Well, I hope you're having a good day at work. So my grandfather, I mentioned this when we had our long 8-hour, when I had my long 8-hour stream, right? with Dat Katie and Talorgs, right? That well, my grandfather was a shochet. He was a kosher butcher, so like he knew the rules very, very strictly, right? And then when I went to yeshiva, I wanted to focus on Shabbat rules, but you have to know kosher rules as well. And so that was another thing that interested me, because I remember I thought you had to be a rabbi to be a kosher butcher. Not necessarily, no. However, the mashgiach, right? The mashgiach, the kosher overseer. No. It doesn't require a rabbi necessarily to do the butchering. There are kosher butchers, but they need a rabbi, a mashgiach, right? A verifier. That's kind of what that means, right? It literally means like an appointee, right? That's why it kind of almost sounds like the word Mashiach, like the anointed, right? They are the appointed one. They go and make sure that like they're not so, that the meat that they're using is kosher meat. That they're not using specific, like there are some Jewish people who there is a, is it the sciatic nerve? I want to say it's the sciatic nerve. I love the process when they come in with the torch and cleanse everything. Oh yeah. One time it was funny because there was this very young rabbi, right? That was like the junior rabbi that was like in training, right? Before he got his own like congregation later on, because like again in New York it's very different, like because that there are places where you can build and there's always that demand, right? But when he was doing that with the like flamethrower thing, I don't know what else to call it, the like flamethrower thing, he like almost pointed it right in my face. I was like, don't do that. Like, please do not do that. That's not safe. Yeah, I know. I was like, bro, like you got to be careful. Yeah, I was like, what are you doing? And they're like, oh, I wanted to see if you wanted to do it for a while. I'm like, well, you don't hand me the fire side. You know what you mean? Like, you come next to me and say, here. You know what I mean? But typically the way how they've done it, so you don't have to be a rabbi and necessarily to be a kosher butcher. But you do muzzle swept by the holy torch. Yes, pretty much. But they essentially have to have a rabbi come in and verify that the meat that you're selling is not like camel meat. And in fact, this is actually why it's funny you bring that up, Anita, because there's a really funny story about the man who later became the chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, right? There was this guy that was supposedly a kosher butcher, right? And he would sell sell meat very cheaply, cheaper than all the other people in this was back in the day when there was a large Jewish community in Cairo. And this person, Ovadia Yosef, was there as the chief rabbi in Cairo. He was the chief rabbi of Egypt at the time. And so he went there to go inspect, and right away, like, he saw someone walking away from it and asked her, like, hey, do you mind if I look at what you bought? Right? Because I keep hearing that, like, oh, he sells really, meat at a much cheaper price, but it's still kosher. And I just want to see what it is, right? I just want to see, like, oh, like his work, etc. And she's like, sure. And then as soon as he looked at it, he could tell it was camel meat. Because it looks different from beef, for example. But it's similar looking, right? But it's much darker, right? That's the thing, is that like people think you're giving them almost like a better cut of meat just because it looks darker. But it's not. It's just like the structure of the camel, right? So anyway, so then he found out that this guy, yeah, no, I totally get that, but that's not kosher under Jewish law. And because he was lying, he went there and told them, like, because you're lying, I'm going to place you in cherem, right? And you can no longer sell meat until we can solve this problem. Like, he was trying to help him. And then at one point, so this was years later, right? Like, he hated him, all this weird stuff happened. Then that dude literally showed up in his house when he was living now in what is now the state of Israel, and like legit just like asked the kid, asked his son, who is now the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, if he knew where his father was, right? Because he was the chief rabbi, because he was an important rabbi, people go to rabbis' houses all the time, like to ask questions, like, oh, how do I toivel this? How do I do this? How do I do that, right? And so the boy let him in the house, right, not knowing that this dude legit has a gun and he's trying to kill him, because he essentially ruined him when he did that, because he didn't want to change his ways. He's like, I was doing good business, right? I was making a lot of money, and now you've revealed that actually I was selling camel meat, and now the whole Jewish community in Egypt doesn't trust me anymore. And it's like, well, yeah, that's your fault, you know? But yeah, he like legit, like, there was so much crazy stuff that happened. So when they do that, what's the exact purpose? Okay. אני רוצה לחדי לך חמה אני אבות. Aw, thank you so much. אני גם אוהב אותך. כל כך שמח. Aw, that's so sweet. כל כך. רגשות has Thank you. Oh yeah, I love speaking Hebrew. Like that was one of my things that like that like growing up when I was in like around like Mexican people and like around Mexican kids, they would always make fun of me. They're like, oh, you speak this weird other language. I'm like, that's how white people talk about us. You know what I mean? Like the way how you're mistreating me for speaking Hebrew and whatever, Yiddish or whatever. It's like that's the way how white people say stuff. I mean, I obviously it's not the same, but it's like, but so the purpose of when they do that with the torch is that the belief is that, or rather the understanding is that like when you get something to be very hot, right? Like it releases all of the kind of like the residual stuff, right? Like how like soap, right, is always trying to get rid of as much of the grease as possible, right? Like 99.9%. So like that's what they're trying to do, right? Like, oh, if you make this so that it's glowing red, hot, right? Then like I'll just make up something like that spoon is now officially clean, right? And it's a way to do it that, or say a grill, right? I think a grill is probably a better example because like people do that with grills kind of more normally, where they want to get rid of all of the stuff that's there before, right? And they want it to be so that then it's considered clean. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, October. Thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. 7 months, wow. Yeah, of course. Am I confusing religions, or do kosher meats have to be considered clean of the hoof? What do you mean by clean of the hoof? So the thing is that it has to have a ruminatory, right? Like, it has to have a ruminatory stomach, right? Like kind of like a cow, right? Like I think a cow and say a goat and a sheep are probably the best examples. Like those things are considered kosher, right? Because they have to have a cloven hoof, right? Which means it has to have a cleft in it, and they have to chew of the cud. So that gets rid of a lot of things that are, again, they have to also have a ruminatory stomach, or stomachs, or, well, technically it's one stomach, 4 chambers when it comes to cows, but you know what I mean. But those are the things, right? And another thing is Jews cannot eat predatory animals. That is to say, they cannot, or technically speaking, like Jewish people cannot eat things like let's just say wolf, right? I'm just gonna give that as an example. Like you cannot eat things that beasts of prey. And another thing too is like the idea of kosher butchering is to. This is actually why a lot of Jewish people, especially the more religious you get, a lot of them become very vegetarian because they realize that a lot of the strictness there is also for, on one hand, to make sure that like other mitzvot, sometimes called in English commandments, are kept, right? Like the one against eating blood, for example, but also the one against eating bugs, also, and so, yeah, so that's usually what comes into a lot of these things. But also, on the other hand, is for making sure that the animals don't suffer, right? Like that's what the butchering, the actual process of the processing, right? Like the actual act, I guess I'll put it like that. That's why you have to use a blade that has no nicks, no cuts, and is super, super, super sharp, right? And it has to be done in once, and that's it, right? Because the whole point is the animal cannot suffer unnecessarily. Like if anything happens to the animal, if it's sick, if it's pregnant, if it's all of these other aspects, you can't eat it. So it narrows down like the amount of things you can eat when it comes to meat, and then also you can't cause it suffering, right? Because if you cause it suffering, you cause it stress, then you can't go through with the process. So like my grandfather, when my family was still living in Mexico, they were still living in Tijuana actually. He designed, and he was like the foreman of this company that was building a dairy farm, right? But they were specifically making kosher, like milk that could be made as kosher, right? And so he had to build specific sized stables, I guess, where they, or pens, or I don't even know what to call them now, but for the cows, right? Because they have to be fed differently. They have to, there's like a difference between just like the way how they're generally used and the way how Jewish people will accept it. Because again, you can't have them suffering. You can't have, like veal is not a big thing in Jewish culture either, because that requires a young animal, right? So again, this is why a lot of Jewish people tend to be rather vegetarian or pescatarian, because under Jewish law, fish isn't meat, technically speaking. So you could be a vegetarian under Jewish law and still eat fish, but most people now kind of say I'm a pescatarian, right? Like I've encountered that a lot in the Jewish community. I've never really heard non-Jewish people say that they're pescatarians, right? And again, I think it's because there's that distinction, right, where fish and eggs aren't considered meat, but they're considered parev or parve, right? They're considered parev, so they're this like neutral category that can go. This is why Ashkenazi Jews will have bagels with schmear and then salmon, right? Smoked salmon. Whereas Sephardi Jews, at least in my grandparents' tradition, there were the mixing of even things that looked like meat, that is to say like fish, and dairy were never supposed to happen. Ever. So like growing up, I never had like fish and meat, so to speak. More gun violence? What happened? Did something happen in LA? Hi October, I'm so glad you made it to the stream. That my meat science professor could have been totally whack, but he explained that the reason why animals had to have those had to meet those requirements was because animals were known not to harbor many diseases. So yes, so in one sense you are correct. There is so another thing too is that the pigs, as we know them, right, as we know them now, well, I guess, evolutionarily speaking, right, the area that part of the Levant, right, that the Canaanites lived in, and then were the separate identities of Israelites and then Judeans or Jews, right, later on sort of it came to be a separate identity, is not very conducive to actually having pigs. They actually harm the environment a lot. And so it was never a big thing to herd or to have pigs, because that whole area is not like it's almost impossible to have pigs in any capacity. So there is that too. Like, there is a view, yes, that there is this biomedical kind of understanding, right, like of not getting diseases, and there is that kind of like, oh, a swine, right, but that's kind of something that developed after the fact. Most of it was because in that area, just people, like, pigs don't like even wild swine of different species, right, don't live in that area because it's very difficult for them to live in that area. So like, it's, because it has this weird like arid, but it does have, and then also a huge bunch of it was swampy, like it's just not the type of area where pigs would be, would back in the day would have done really well. Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes. 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 Yes, exactly. It does come from actual health things, like, and this is why you see a general aversion to specific types of animals that then becomes almost theologized, so to speak, right? It almost becomes part of. Oh, thank you so much, Alexi. I appreciate that. So I would say that yes, there is that aspect, and that's why also other Semitic peoples, right, when it came to that, also have that rule as well of not eating pork. Well, for one, because again, like even in Arabia, even in that plateau where most people live, or back in the day where most people lived, also is you can't really have pigs there. Like, there isn't enough water, there isn't enough, grazing land. That's why sheep tend to be the main thing that people had in that area. And then later in the coastal regions you had cows, right? Because there you could have more of that, and also even in the more arid areas too. I mean, as we know in America, like I know when I drive out on the 10 freeway, like as soon as I get out of like the LA Palm Springs area, you see all these farms, and there's a lot of dairy farms out there too. So like aridity is not necessarily something that would hurt that, but yes, it's always been that too. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Okay, oh, thank you so much. Hi, Valpo. I wonder what kind of cows? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So it was viewed as cruel almost to pigs in their environment to raise pigs. Yeah, yes, like the decision to not raise them for this purpose was because when people what people would now consider the Phoenicians or Proto-Phoenicians or Proto-Canaanites, etc., they also recognized that not all of the animals could live there, and so that's why you see this like specific importance on the idea of like lambs, or the idea of cows, or the idea of, and that's why like the god El is often depicted as like a bull, right, like, or an ox, right, whereas pigs, again, just they wouldn't survive. And so the view was like, well, we're not even going to eat them, so that then they won't, because we can't have them because it harms both. Technically, it harms both the human and and another thing too is in Jewish law, you have to feed the animals first, right? Like how there's like this idea of women and children first. Well, under Jewish law, like if you have pets, for example, or if you have livestock, you have to feed them before you feed yourself. Like, that's Jewish law. So like, even if it was something like Shabbat, I would have to give my pets food before I ate Shabbat dinner, let's say, or before Shabbat started, to make sure that they have their food, and they have their stuff, right, water, etc. Whereas again, like that's something that's sort of built into that. I wonder what kind of cows. Well, I mean, like, they always want to talk about the red heifer, right? But again, the idea of the color red, or what that meant back in the day, is very contentious, because some people say it's like literally red, some people say it's like a rust color, Pardon me for the late question. Oh no, that's totally fine. I had to verify my account. Since You were talking about too much animal suffering not being allowed. Is the way farmers impregnate cows allowed? That's a very good question. I wish that I knew specifically that answer. I don't. I would have to ask like someone that I know that does that, because like the my like I call him my rabbi, even though we don't live in the same city anymore. But I would ask him, and I will ask him, Cat, and if you're in the Discord, let me see if it will show up. I can respond to you that question. From what I understand, I would think not, but because I don't think that's the only way you can do it, right? Because they do that so then that way they can get milk, right? Like that way they can have a consistent milk production. I don't think that's necessarily that important. Especially now, because most people I know that are Jewish use alternative milk, right? Like they don't use necessarily cow's milk for things. Like even the most religious people I know, they use rice milk. They use rice milk because then you have to wait a certain period of time, like an hour, before you can eat something else, right? It's like when you eat meat, you have to wait 6 hours before you can eat something that has dairy. So, and it's this view that like you don't want to get dyspeptic, right? Like you don't want to get like stomach problems, like sick, right? From the mixing. But also, of course, the religious angle, right? You don't want to mix blood and blood and milk together. But from what I understand, or at least from what I am thinking of, from what I remember reading, I don't think so. But again, I have no idea, because again, I thought that the way how they did that with Kine was that they specifically did it so as to continue milk production, right, and all of that. So yes, Google. I love the history of cows. Oh, you know what's so funny? Also, hi Buffy Geek. It's so good to see you. I'm so glad you made it to the stream. And yes, I know I love this emote. There's actually a book, Miss Frizzle, that I can tell you about, that's actually talking about, like, it's talking about it's talking about it from like a post-humanist perspective, but it's looking at cows, right? Like it's actually, in fact, the person that wrote it, I think, is from Texas too. Most likely. I'm pretty sure that they are Texan. But anyway, the point being that I could link you their book if I recall it. I have it generally in my head, like who they are. Like I know them. I just don't remember the book, but it's all about cows. So and like again, it shows how the people that think like, oh, I have a degree in this means I cannot do that, is not true. I mean, like, like they literally went from being a mendicant priest in Tijuana to becoming like a professor, right? So you have that, and then they're originally from Texas, so okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll send it to you once. Yeah, cows aren't human, but and another thing too is there's always this view that such things should only happen if there are exigent circumstances, right? Like something is making you have to do that. Otherwise, there's no reason why to disturb the natural process, so to speak, right? Because from what I understand, when it does come to that, is that, oh well, okay. Let me put it to you in a slightly different way. Maybe this, I don't think it will answer your question, but it might allow us to complicate it and think about it in another way. Is that when I got my puppies, right? A lot of them I got them from the one of my first one I got from the what is it called? The like the LA County Pet Rescue or whatever it's called. I don't know, because they recently changed its name to, or no, I don't think they changed its name. Whatever it's called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the where they have all of this, where you adopt, pets. And this poor little puppy, yeah, the pet rescue, yeah, there we go, the LA pet rescue or shelter. There was this little tiny puppy, a toy Chihuahua, that was found on the street, right? Sort of like south of downtown LA, and this one that I'm talking about is the one that's actually, if I remember correctly, I think it still is a kill shelter. And essentially, if someone didn't take this puppy, who essentially was like born and then immediately brought into the system, that they would, so they would terminate, so to speak. And so I saw this little tiny puppy again, because it's a toy Chihuahua, and I felt so sad, that I could not understand why they would do that, right? Like, obviously, not every, obviously it's not like the whole town comes in here to look for a pet all the time. I don't think that, but so the thing is that when I was, that's when I was still like still fresh out of like the whole yeshiva, etc. stuff, and so by Jewish law, right, I couldn't have her be fixed, as people will say, right? But on my own, I had to have someone else take her in on their own, and then do it, and then give it back to me, right? I cannot do that to an animal, at least in Jewish law, right? That's not something you can do, because that's actively removing, an aspect of the animal that is seen as, natural, so to speak, right? But I guess actually that sounds really weird, but I think people understand what I'm trying to get at, right? Like it's not like the dog could consent to it, right? Nor is it that the dog, nor is it that any pet. You read a while ago, shelters teamed up for workers. Yeah, okay, good. I used to work in that industry. I did a very brief stint with someone who did. Oh yeah, now trying to work through everything from work. Oh, that's awesome. That's interesting. So anyway, so it's like something like that. You can't do that. And also, again, like there's a lot of stuff that's very concerned with the welfare of animals. That is why a lot of people, particularly of the more like humanist kind of or even reform Jewish communities, which is the largest Jewish contingent in the United States, they tend to be very much like for like animal rights and protections because of that. Because there's already this kind of built-in like concern with an animal and trying to make sure that you're not harming them and to make sure that you're not. So I think when it comes to the cow, like when it comes to what you were asking me, I feel that knowing what I know and just like trying to think through it, I would say no, they probably wouldn't do that because then it's not, because then you're like extracting something else from the cow, right? Like it's not about, you're no longer caring about the cow itself, so to speak, right? More what it produces, and that's not really what it's supposed to be. But of course, I mean, that I can say that with any, complete certainty is, I do know that there probably are some rabbis somewhere that do say that it's fine. But from what I understand, and from what I'm thinking, a conversation I had with my rabbi, then I remember that when they would do kosher certification, they never brought up, they said like stuff like that didn't really happen, even in kosher dairies. But again, that might be just because that, those dairies are just, decided not to do that, right? So that's tough because it's not like you live in the country, then it wouldn't be necessarily an issue. I live near a highway. So not fixing my hat isn't an option. They could be, yeah. I mean, there's that, right? I mean, there is that aspect too, which is why, like, that in itself is not the issue. The issue is, like, you don't want to do anything to your animals that are under your charge, so to speak, right? Your pets, right? That takes away from them, right? Like, you don't want to deprive them of anything. And so the idea of not doing things like that to an animal, especially when it comes to a pet, is there as a kind of way to say, I understand that the law, like in the United States or whatever, county law, whatever, it demands that I spay or neuter the pet, but I'm not the one that wants to do that, so to speak, right? Like, I can't do that. Because I can't make that decision for the dog, so to speak. That's kind of a way of thinking about it. So that's why I'm thinking, from what I understand, and even from my own grandfather, like, I don't remember that ever being a thing, like, in what I've seen, in what I've experienced, in my own personal experience. I've never seen that, what you described, but I have seen the, like, oh, let me, like, can you please be the one to do the, the operation for this and this, right? Because I can't, right? A lot of people justify over a bull because the amount of bulls you would have to go through to avoid catastrophic inbreeding, blah blah blah, reducing production costs. No, I think, to me, and another thing too is that the amount of kosher milk that has to be produced is a lot less. And also another thing too, I just remembered, most USDA milk, if I remember correctly, is considered, for the most part, I mean, now thinking about it, I do remember this rabbi that's like a rabbi that you can actually, like, contact and ask questions in this way, but of course they're Orthodox. I remember them saying something like, oh, all the milk that's, like, USDA blah blah blah, it's, yeah, so is okay for Jewish people to drink, but again, that is, yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I get that. But again, one, like, if you are going to produce kosher specific milk, it's a lot less, because that's why most people just tend to drink part of milk, right? Because then, like, for example, when I would go with my great uncle, and I would stay at his house, because he actually lives inside of I don't know if people know what I mean by an Eruv, but I will explain it. It's essentially like this wire that they put around a whole neighborhood or a whole area of a city, right? Particularly, obviously, in a very Jewish area, and that it allows for certain aspects like carrying, right, to occur. But my uncle lives just outside of it, so once all of the, him and they were taking, like, a young toddler, and he couldn't carry the toddler until they reached the Eruv, right? Because you can't carry on Shabbat. So until we entered that, where that line is, right? And most people can't even tell that it's there. But like, unless you're Jewish and like, oh, after this point you can start carrying, then you see people carrying things, right? In fact, I actually remember a friend of mine used to have this thing. It's very common in the Orthodox world, where, like, you put your house keys around your, like, instead of having them like this and putting them in your pocket, right, or having them out or whatever, instead you put them on your body, like, with those, like, I don't know what they are. They're, like, really, really stretchy, and they, like, so then that way you're not carrying it, so to speak. Again, it just depends on, like, what affiliation you have. But I just remember that, like for me, I would just have a key that only worked for my, like, I would just have, like, a separate key that was just for Shabbat that I would put in my pocket, and just, like, that was my house key, right? Like, that was it. But to each their own, I guess. Um, but yeah, I mean, again, I'm now remembering. Yeah, there was a rabbi that said that generally speaking, most USDA grade milk is okay to drink. Although if you can't carry Shabbat, what do pregnant people do? Well, imagine. I remember even my old oven had a button for that. You would press it, and over an hour later, the oven would turn on. I always thought it was silly, as if God doesn't know that pressing the button turned on the oven. Yeah, I know. Like, at one point, my parents were considering buying appliances with a Shabbat mode, right? But they kind of were like, it doesn't really matter, especially because like, because one, it just adds in all of these extra costs, right, that you have to pay. But also Shabbat, yeah, it has a Shabbat mode. So what that means is that, like, if you set it up like the fridge, for example, like, like when you, so, like, let me explain what happens in my friend's house that his family's still Orthodox. Is that when he's there and he has to keep Shabbat, they put tape, on that little thing that makes it so that, like, it turns on the little refrigerator light. So they have to put duct tape on it or whatever. So then that way when they open it during Shabbat, it doesn't turn on the light. So you can open up the fridge, but you can't turn on that light. So there are things like that. And also you can't turn off things you turned on before Shabbat, and you can't turn on things that were turned off before Shabbat. So again, this is why there are these things called Shabbat lamps, right, that you can buy that essentially are like always on, but you can like shut them. They're like LED or something, and you can shut them, and then throughout the day you can like open, or at night, right, throughout the evening, you can open it a little bit more to get full light. In your house, of course. But like there, I do remember that they had that they put tape. Whereas if you have Shabbat mode, it automatically like doesn't turn on the lights. And also it will do things like, it's like, I don't know, like, it just depends on what you get. Like, usually the thing I noticed that is Shabbat mode are the refrigerators. The electric bill? Oh, no, these things aren't connected to the light. It's like a thing you can carry around. It's not like but that is true. Because again, if you want to use the bathroom, right, at night, you have to leave that light on, right, to be able to use it at night. Otherwise, you would have to go there in the dark, and you couldn't turn on the light. So that's why I've noticed that some people have bought like Shabbat lights and put it in rooms, so then that way their light bill can go a little bit less. Because otherwise then they have to leave the lights on all night, through all of Shabbat until the 25 hours are over, and then they can shut them off if they want to. I'm that person in my house who is very annoying about all the lights being up. No, I totally get that. I mean, it's also why I prefer lamps to like the lights up, on the ceiling, because I hate having to like go up there and like change them all out. Instead, I'd rather just have like a lamp, and it's easier for me. But yeah, I totally get that. But yeah, so that's why, like, for me, like, when I remember when I would go to my great uncle's house, they had this little light thing on, and you could kind of like move it to another direction, right? And so then, like, when I'm gonna go to sleep, the light's still on, but I make it face the other direction, because they still keep Shabbat, right? So I have to be respectful of their observance. So I typically will, like, go with them. I mean, even if we go to the synagogue, for example, I won't necessarily do anything, right? Like my great uncles my uncles never really minded me just like sitting there. But anyway, the reason why I was bringing up my great uncle is because when we get up, on Shabbat morning, right, when we have to go into the shul particularly Jewish men, have to go to the shul, right, to do Shacharis, which also it's longer than usual, right, because it's Shabbat, where they actually bring out like the Torah scroll and everything, and they have people reading different parts, etc. Then they actually, so what we would have to do is in the morning, right, when we got up, we would eat cereal, right, with rice milk or with almond milk or with whatever it might be, because then we knew that once shul was over, like once like praying time was over, right, so to speak, and then always, this is something that always happens, typically, you will, afterwards they will have a meal for you, right, on Shabbat, and it's like a lunch, and one of the things they always serve, particularly if you go to a Hasidic synagogue, is cholent. Now, it's kind of difficult for me to explain cholent, but it's essentially like it's like a beef stew, but like you put like all these different like beans in there, and some people put kishka, some people put sausages, so it has meat, right? And because of that, you don't want to have eaten dairy, because otherwise then, and also it also depends how your minhag, how they say how long it should be before you drinking dairy, that then you can eat eat meat, right? So for most people it's about an hour, but I have heard of some people where it's 3 hours, which I don't really get that. And then there are some that are even more lenient that say, well, if it's like liquid milk, so to speak, and you rinse out your mouth, right, and you like have drunk water, right, to like make it go away, as it were, then you're fine, right? But for me, growing up, it was always like it's at least an hour before you can eat meat afterwards. Oh yeah, see, well, the thing is about being like in university is like you don't get a classroom, right? Like that's always one of the things that I'm always like, in some ways, like sometimes I'm like, okay, it's nice because then I can, see what other classrooms are like, and I've already kind of thought about like, oh, I actually like this classroom best, right? Because it has a nice view, it faces north or whatever, whatever it might be, it doesn't really matter, but like because there are like in some universities, especially like big ones, like say USC, UCLA, blah blah blah, whatever, sometimes they will even have classes that are like in the basement, right? And I've never liked those. I've never liked classrooms in the basement. I've always found those very weird. And it's interesting too, because like they decided to put some. I from what I understand at USC, and I'm just bringing this up because last night, they call me Taj was talking about USC Hospital. We'll see. Well, I can see why people like them. I can see why. And I noticed that a lot of the like computer labs, they like to put them down there because it's kind of like, then like if people are going to do something, right, it doesn't. Yeah, no, I get that. It's old and needs improvement, but it's cozy. See, yeah, like I just like I don't like the idea of having a set classroom is just something I just don't even. Instead, it's like you walk into a room that is purposefully made to be emptied out after each lesson, right? And hi, Digit K. I have another teacher moving in with me next year. Oh, okay. And well, it's like, and then I think obviously there's a difference between our, as it were, pedagogical, populations, right? They're usually the most neglected classrooms. That is true. That is true that I have seen that, but no. The building I'm thinking of is not that old. It's not from like 74 or something. I'm not talking about like the Waffle Building in UCLA or something. I'm talking about like the one I'm thinking of is at USC, and it's like way in the back. So it's newer. And it has, if I remember correctly, it has the computer lab classrooms down in the bottom. So like some people that teach history, like to use computers so that then they can, it depends, like, their pedagogical experience. I always find that that's typically leads to them being distracted, right? Which I get. Like, I mean, I totally understand that. My computer on Windows 7, oh my gosh. As long as they work, right? As long as they work. No, but I totally get that. No, like, for me, it's like I just never liked those classrooms because it usually meant that they stop security? Yeah, I think so. I think so that they did. That rings a bell for sure. That they stopped doing security updates. But regardless, yeah, like, I just remembered that, like, at USC when I went to visit someone that I knew there, that, like, they had classrooms at the bottom, like, in what to me seemed like a basement. But I don't remember what building it was. I just know that it was way, like, usually when I approach, I guess, USC, it's from the freeway. Like, I get off the freeway, turn right on that exit street, right? Can't remember its name right now. And then right there's, like, USC on the left-hand side, and then it's like it's Islamic Center on the other. Like, that's how I usually get to USC. So the IT came in 2 years ago and was like, I'll try to get these replaced for you, but it may be a few years. Yeah, like when it comes to anything with dealing with, like, public slash state education, it's just ridiculous how, like, they literally will let, like, the worst things happen and then be like, oh, well, and then they always try to, like, blame you somehow, even though, like, you were the ones telling them, like, hey, these things don't work, can you please change them? And they're like, oh, but if you hadn't, yeah, I totally get that. As of January 10th this year, yeah, they stopped servicing. Okay. They should probably look into updating those if they don't want a massive security breach. I can't even imagine that, like, the how many people are still on Windows 7, actually, thinking about it. Like, I know people that are still on Windows Vista, for example. Old computers and textbooks? No, if we're gonna ignore that and build the new sports uniforms and do... Yeah, pretty much. And 1.5 million? That's cheap. I'm just gonna say that. I mean, it's maybe because I live in California, but to me, 1.5 million does not seem like... To me, that's like... It's like they updated one seat, essentially. Textbooks suck so bad. Oh yeah, no, I totally get that. And so the text that I use, the way how I usually do it is I will have them get, like, text. You know what I mean? Like, oh, if we're gonna discuss, right, like, the history of this, I'd rather you read the authors from this time period or read stuff that's happening in this time period, so that way you know what's actually going on. And maybe if there's, like, a short overview monograph type of thing that I could maybe find, and, or articles that might help do that, because obviously I'm going to be saying a lot of stuff too, right? And so I tend to focus on that, and also trying to, like, introduce them to it in multiple different ways, right? Like, not just I don't do the whole, like, I'm going to stand at the front of the classroom and just, like, say stuff, right? That's not how it's ever really worked for me. And that's why I don't depend on textbooks, right? Instead, I prefer, like, primary texts with secondary sources, right, that are academic, right? So, getting you phone cues. No. Trust me, like, I have no problem with that. But the thing is that it always comes as a detriment to something else, right? Like, for example, like, there's a university I know, I think it's in, I want to say it's Colorado, I could be wrong though. It's like southern Colorado. I can't tell southwest or southeast, I don't remember. But it's like a smaller university, it's not like a big, like, anyway. It's not like UC at Boulder, like UFC at Boulder, right? It's not that, right? It's smaller than that, much smaller. They essentially gutted their, and this is something that's very common. I probably mentioned it at another university I know. where they essentially gutted their history department to where now they also cannot take on graduate students. Like, they have professors that can only teach like introductions to blank and blank history, right? But they can not do like anything higher, like too advanced, because they essentially got rid of the PhD program. They are essentially getting rid of the master's program too. Like once this cohort of students is done doing their masters, like they've already said like we're not gonna take any more cohorts in, and so they had no problem cutting like cultural studies, ethnic studies, history, right, which are all kind of like, you know, connected to one another. Right, like they got rid of all of these like social sciences, humanities stuff, and then they said, oh well, since we saved all of this money, now we're gonna put it to, you know, the business school, which is the other thing. The business school, like that's what always gets tons of bills. Just like, I mean, like entire purses just thrown at them, right? Like endlessly at the business school, and then the sports stuff, right? Because they like Miss Frizzle saying like there are sponsors, right? But it's I mean so let me see what. Yeah. It always comes at the cost of something else, or even if they don't have to actually use money from, you know, whatever department, they will still use that as justification to reduce the department. Like, oh well, we need to focus more on blank, right? So that's why we need to, you know, just make eight positions out of the 12 in this entire college, you know, adjuncts or part-time positions, right? Or sometimes they'll even call them career track, like as a kind of obfuscation. But all that means is that the people that are teaching 5 like university courses every semester, and that's a lot. I mean, that is a lot of courses to be teaching. Like the average like tenured professor teaches a 2-1, sometimes a 3-2, but I mean that's the most. 5 is like impossible. Like that means no research is going to get done. Like if that's what you want to be as to do research, you're never going to get it done ever. But way too often, especially here in the South, other problems suffer so they can keep. Yeah. Some kids only come to school for the sports. Well, see, like I dislike the fact that they can't divorce the sports program, so to speak, from everything else, right? Like it's like they treat it as if it needs to be like one. It's already given all these exemptions, right? Like you know, where it's like the coaches can get paid a lot of money, blah blah blah. Like it doesn't have to be commensurate to other professors, for example. Whereas in other departments, whereas in actual academic departments, like the scale, right, of pay that goes up year by year, sometimes will get like reduced a little bit, right, like over time. So then that way, like they're saving money, but it's because, you know, now they have to do more introductory courses because there are more students at the university, but now there's less students taking, right, like a humanities BA or a social sciences, you know, BA or whatever, it might be BS. They are really programs that we need. Yeah, our school cuts many programs in the year. I started going there and then immediately 2 new football gyms and got a new gym. Oh yeah, like those are like. So this is a big problem in U.S. education, and is that they want to make it so that like they want to sell college experience as an experience, right? It's no longer like an education, so to speak. It's like college as a social club, right? And this actually has some roots in the fact that before colleges opened up to the average person, they very much were more like a social club, right? Like because only people whose sons did not have to work would go to, like, say, the Ivy Leagues, which back then they didn't have to pay, and they would just like stay there, and that's where they made these connections that then helped them later on, right, when they came into their inheritance, right? Which is why, you know, you have a lot of people like Trump, for example. He went to Wharton, But it obviously, it's not like that's where he learned business, right? Like, that's not like, you don't actually learn that. Like, I've actually like walked past classrooms that are in the business college at different universities, and I'll never forget one. This one was in New York. No, it was in New Jersey. I think it was well, I know it's all called Rutgers, right? Rutgers. I just can't remember which one it is. But anyway, point being that I heard them saying, like, talking about the whole like supply demand and like drawing the line that kind of looked to me like the fuck around and find out graph, like exactly. But like they were teaching that, and I'm like, that's literally not how the world works. Like, you know what I mean? Like, like it's not it like. And this was like an advanced, like, or at least a 300 level course. And I'm just like, how are you teaching? Like, this doesn't even make sense. Even if you are a business person, like, even they know this isn't how it works. At my school, the business school doesn't even make money. Yeah, I mean, they don't have to, right? Because it's seen as more of a place to make connections than anything else. It's just wild that to me that our education system is dictated by money. I mean, I honestly have no way to understand how even state institutions, right? Like Cal State Fresno, for example. Like, they will, like, even though they're known, like, one of the people that they've had, right, professors and everything, and also alum that went there too, turned out to become this, like, horrible neocon, like, pro-Trump guy, but he was like this whole thing about how like, oh, like the humanities are being ruined. And then I'm like, yeah, and literally the person that you support politically and everything, all the policies you support are there to get rid of the humanities, right? It's like they like to complain that, oh, the humanities are being taken over by blah blah blah. But again, like most humanities departments are not these like super liberal spaces. In fact, it was only up until the 80s, really, that the humanities, well, the 70s and 80s, that the humanities in the United States in particular started to be seen as more left than the sciences, right? Because before, the sciences were seen as the like, oh, that's where all the libs, that's where all the revolutionary blah blah blah, like that's where they want to go. Then there was that shift, right, with the change from post-structuralism that you have, when critical theory becomes a big thing and you get feminist theory and all of that stuff. Like, when you have this turn, so to speak, that again wasn't really that much of a thing. Like, it's not like it happened in every university in America. It just happened in like Columbia, right? Or it happened at Harvard or whatever, right? It's like they had one scholar that did X thing, and then like when you read about it in critical, when you read about critical theory in this historical sense, people act like, oh yes, now everybody in this entire department was, reading Edward Said, right? It's like, no. I mean, Edward Said might have worked at Columbia, but it doesn't mean that the whole, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, like, one does not go necessarily with the other. But that's how right-wingers like to sell that, right? That, because there's this kind of, like, myth of, like, the long walk through the institutions that the left did, and I'm like, when did they ever do that? Like, that never happened. Academia is one of the most conservative places in the entire United States. Like, I mean, like, there are no real leftist professors that are famous, etc. None of that. In fact, it's made so that those people are taken away from the chances of having their job. It's conformity that, to an extent, obviously, but it's this kind of view like that, like, you could not be an open communist and like be considered for a job, right? But if you're like an open Trump supporter, that's totally fine, right? That's okay. You could literally get lesser education just by going to a lesser funded school because you just happen to live. I mean, that's what I'm saying about UC Fresno. Or pardon me, Cal State Fresno. Right? Like that area, like Visalia, Fresno, like all those are, right? Like the vast majority of people that live in that part of the state of California, most of them are either like their parents, their grandparents, or sometimes even some of them, like in this generation, are the people that work the fields, right? Like my family has a long connection with that area, particularly like Visalia, etc. So when I see UC Fresno and some dude that like Victor Davis Hanson, who like 20 years ago was like, oh my gosh, the humanities are being ruined, you know, and now sort of being like, oh, but Trump is gonna save everything. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, you know what I mean? Like, yes, Trump is like, oh, thinking about like what Thucydides said, like Rich Dad Poor Dad. Oh my gosh. You know what is so funny about that book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, is that in the book itself, the guy that wrote it, his name escapes me right now, talks about how he's so good at grifting, right, that he could sell this book. Like, in the book itself, there's this weird meta commentary of how, like, even the book itself is, like, part of his grift, right? Like, he talks about it. He's like, oh yeah, I'm so good at selling bullshit that, like, I was even able to sell this book, right? And it's like, you're reading it and you're just like, what? You know, like, yeah, it is trash. It's worse than trash. Bring him the Communist Manifesto. Oh my gosh. The funny thing is that people think that, like, this is the issue I have with the Communist Manifestos. People think of it, I think because in America we don't have manifestos in the same way that they exist in Europe, right? So, like, both parties in Britain, right, like the Labour Party and the Conservatives, I know there are other parties, but like the two main parties, right, they publish a manifesto, right, their party's manifesto, right, and this happens all over Europe where they publish manifestos, but in America we call them, what do we call them? Platforms, right? Like, what is the Democratic Party platform? Well, that's their manifesto, right? So, like, oftentimes it's necessary to explain that, like, it's historical contingency of what is said in the Communist Manifesto, right? Like, it's a direct response to the revolutions of 1848, right? Hence its publication date, right? Or to, you know, what's going on in that time period, right? Across the German states, right? So to me, that's why I always feel like, you know, yes, you know, introduce them in whatever way you can, but don't let them think that, like, the manifesto is this, like, definitive document, because a lot of right-wingers like to think it is, because then they can look at the parts where, like, you know, again, we're historically contingent, that Engels and Marx write about, and then say, oh, see, he got this, you know, they got this wrong, right? Like, that's what they love to do. Like, they don't actually want to read it for its content and then take it to a logical conclusion. They just read it so then they can be like, oh, look, Marx said this, and he didn't take into, you know. It's much shorter, and yeah. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying to not do that. I'm just saying, like, there has to be, you know, like, this is where I think the idea of working with people to introduce them to Marxism really is, this is the reason why, like, you can't debate, right? You can't debate on a screen and convince people that way. Like, we already know that's not what happens, right? Rather, if you know someone and you're willing to be there and say, like, you know, like, why don't we discuss these things, right? Like, actually have that personal connection, then people are more likely to, you know, consider changing, or at least questioning, right? That's why our, like, econ professor would always say, all things being, always. They always say things like that. And that's the reason why, like, when I was learning, like, when I was doing economic theory in my undergraduate and for my master's, like, I remember, like, people essentially trying to say that, like, well, you know, if we just think about economics in this, like, they were trying to say it's not a binary, but essentially they essentially just reinvented a binary, right? Like, instead of first world, third world, they just put, like, core and periphery, right? When it comes to Wallenstein, and you know, I mean, I think Wallenstein is probably, like, the most known of when it comes to that, right? Of world systems theory, right? But the problem is that it doesn't take into account, or rather, it doesn't really explain imperialism, right? Instead, it makes things like, it makes things seem like, well, right now Haiti is in the periphery, but one day it could be, and that's not really how things work. Even the best biz professors I had for marketing stuff or girl boss grind set pushers, oh yeah, that's literally all they can do, is just tell you to just grind all day forever and just like never question once what's actually, going on. When I was in college, yeah, I get that. I wish more scientists were revolutionaries. Oh yeah, no. Like, this is the thing, is like, this is when you had people like, again, like, I mean, even someone like Albert Einstein, right? Like, in physics, right? Like, the sciences were seen as this, like, oh, this horrendous, rabble of leftists, right? And that's why, like, the sciences were not really funded in the same way, because they were seen as, like, unless they were seen in the form of, like, utility. This is why, like, engineering is one thing, right? But, like, when it came to the more, I guess, abstract, hard, I don't even know how to, I honestly don't even know how to word it, but, like, physics, right, biology, etc. It's like, this is why even into the 20th century you still get naturalists, right, coming out of biology programs, right, instead of, like, actual, like, biologists that specialize in something, right? It's not that there's nothing wrong with naturalists, it's just that it's a 19th century bourgeois thing to be a naturalist. And, like, that doesn't, like, now there really aren't naturalists like that anymore, right? At least in that 19th century way. Capitalist Coke goes hard in STEM. Yeah, I mean, one thing too is, like, STEM likes to make it seem, capitalists love to make STEM see that it's like the preferable option. Because again, it's like this weird argument from utility, right? That it's like, well, science actually gives us, and this is where universities come in, right? Because then they can develop patents, right? Which then the university can essentially take from the original owner, right? Claim it as their own, right? Like, oh, well, you used our laboratory, right? You used our stuff, right? And a lot of universities like that, like, oh, as long as you can give us lots of patents and lots of, whatever it might be, that's worthwhile. Because what does that mean? Then it means that if people need to use such thing, they have to contact the university, and right? And so that's typical, and it's always like this weird, like, oh, we have more innovation, like I think it's University of the Redlands, I think is what it's called. I don't know. It's going out on the 10 almost to Palm Springs, and like they legit do the whole like, oh, we're like we're ranked by USA, Today college, that whole college top 10 best college or top 100 college, and it's like, oh yeah, we were ranked the 17th most innovative university in the country. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, innovative, like, in what sense? And of course they're measuring it through like how many people, right, in this case typically underpaid RAs, right, are producing patents that are then counted towards the tenured professor and also the university, right? Because very, very, very few times will they let the actual RA that's doing all of the work count it as their own, right? Because they'll be like, oh, well, you can't because you were actually helping this person's research. That's a very common thing that happens in STEM. At least, again, like, in my own understanding, that's something I've just seen happen a lot. But it also happens in the humanities, too. It's just very different. Because with professors that do that, they usually try to, like, make you contribute to what they, like, get you to do all of the hard work of getting stuff introduced into the scholarly discussion, so that then they can, like on one hand, universities tell you to be collaborative, right? But then you also have to compete against each other, and that makes no sense. Like, well, we can't collaborate competitively. That doesn't make any sense. Like, those two things are diametric opposites. Yeah, I mean, Bourgeois academia is never going to turn out exactly. There is no reason, that's why it's one of the most right-wing institutions. If you go there, it's the reason why universities are the places that people that are very extremely right-wing, they know that they can use as a catalyst for their far-right message, right? That's why they like to use the idea of the leftist. For example, the whole, this is something that was brought up in Bleep Blop Ben's Twitch chat earlier, but also on their on her stream, I should say. I just noticed that essentially something that I already knew. I just didn't have the article. Was that it was the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in the 90s, that began to use that term, gender ideology, right? And one of the things I said, why do you think it's Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles that are using those terms? Because in the Catholic Church, in its more conservative circles, they are the ones they're the ones that started using that term, and started to weaponize it as they did, as they do now. And you have Young Americans for Liberty and all of that other stuff, right? All those other, clubs, right? That essentially are being funded, it sort of in a way, like they get university funding, but you also know that there's funding that goes beyond that, right? Like there's no way that they can pay for everybody to go to a conference together, right? Using university fund. There's no way. And so, when you see things like that, it's oh, they got a benefactor that just happened to have donated, $2 million to just their club, in a way that they can't make it apply to every other club, right? Where every other club should be able to get that money, right? It's just them. So the bourgeois university is there to just keep. This is the reason why, even when you go for a PhD, right? You will get people that will tell you this isn't the case, right? They will say it's better to write it for a liberal audience, essentially, right? They will try to curtail your thinking, right? I remember once someone emailing me from a journal that I had sent an article to, and they said, we will not publish things that take a Marxist analysis. And I'm like, what? Literally, they were saying, oh yes, as soon as you go into class analysis, right, and look at conflict theory, as soon as you go into that, we cannot have that on our publication, right? And I'm like, so you have all these stuff praising conservatism and in its historical sense, right? But as soon as I do class analysis, suddenly now that's beyond the pale, right? And it's that doesn't make any sense. Maybe some will become revolutionary in spite. No, exactly. The thing about the university system in the U.S. is that because there is this idea of, there is a divide. There is a divide. As much as they like to pretend that there isn't, if you teach at a community college, they view you as less than if you're a tenured professor, right? there is no doubt, and no one should doubt. They have conference after conference, speech after speech, saying, how if you work in a community college, or if you work in K through 12 education, particularly high school, or if you work at a teaching, let's say a liberal arts college, right? They don't see you as on the same level as the ones that are tenured professors at an R1 institution, right? They get a 2-1 teaching load, right? They do see themselves as, and that's the thing, is with that system in place, you cannot have any revolutionary, right? Because it's based on this idea that you've earned this privilege, right? And all it does is just uphold white supremacy, and instead makes people have to focus, right, their own research, so that it doesn't question too much, right? That's an issue, because the whole point of academia is to push beyond that, but most people won't do that until after they receive tenure, right? So. Yeah, oh yeah, he went bankrupt. Yeah. How to get rich off of selling you courses of how to get rich. Yeah, pretty much. Mission statements. Yeah, mission statements. Oh, I wish it could give you more questions to seek out. Or not. Yeah, exactly. I still learn something new each time I read the manifesto, but I read with comrades and have discussions. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like, what I'm saying is like, I guess what my point was more like, I don't want people to fall into this view. Well, I'm not saying that this is something that necessarily you would do, but a lot of people often do this where they will kind of like, let me just drop off this thing, and they will read it and then they will come to understand it, right? Like especially if they've been, if you live in the United States, you lived here your whole life, the liberalism is like encased into everything, right? Like it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in the food, right? So it's very difficult to make people see through that, right? To pierce the veil, so to speak. So what I would say is like, that's why I'm just adding on. I was like leapfrogging or piggybacking on top of that, right? Saying like, however, we also have to remember that, when you are telling workers that, fellow workers, that you you should be reading this, so that way they can gain either union consciousness and then have it become class consciousness, right? Or trying to, again, be there so that way you can raise as much class consciousness as is possible, through your efforts. Like, you have to do that, and that's why like the people that say that like people are indoctrinated into being leftists, it's like, that's not true. For people that are actually leftists, it's quite the opposite. Like, people have no problem thinking that like the education they received in the public education system, right, was neutral, right? When again, like when I lived in Texas, like there was this view that like, oh, like it was wrong of the United States to have gone against Texas during the Civil War because like, oh, it's the one, like, we're the ones that made it able so that way they could steal the rest of Mexico, right? Like steal the rest of the states that they wanted. Right, like it's always this weird transactional type of thinking that I never quite understood. But yeah, also the pay gap between the most useful and the least useful sciences to capitalism. Oh yeah, for sure. Capitalism, like personally, the Fairy King, like I'm very not competitive at all. Like, and it's just so weird because like, I remember when I was still doing my PhD, coursework, and I had to do this, a grant, like I had to apply for a grant, right? Or for like a funding, right? And they said like, okay, but the way how we set it up is that we've decided to make it, well, the way how they had it was you had to compete with everybody else who was also a grad student, right? And they kind of made it, they did this to say, oh, it's more fair, right? But essentially what it was a way so that way they could write off the humanities, right? And say, well, the humanities and the social sciences in particular, like history, etc., does not, or even economics in many cases, does not have a worthy enough project for us to give them money. So that way over the summer they don't have to be starving, right, essentially. So that was kind of like because I mean, they don't even give you that much money, right? But you still have to fight over it, right, with other people. You have to like show that you're the better, person that will deliver more results, right? And so that was always the thing, is like they would make it so that way they could give it to a business school grad student, right, that's getting an MBA or something, right, that they're like, oh, well, what they're doing is much more important because it affects XYZ, whereas your history project, it's like, oh, well, it's interesting, but of course, like, so yeah, you have to appeal to profits. Oh yeah, yeah, I remember like I don't know if you've ever heard of Astley. But yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that. You can't make this stuff. I know, it's like I still have the emails, right? Like, look, like I'll never forget that. Literally, literally shooing me away, saying like maybe you should go to a journal where they actually like Karl Marx, and I'm just like, what? Like, I don't even know what you're saying, bro. Like, I just was like this is one of the like there are 4 fundamental critical like aspects of analysis that people can do when it comes to like looking at cultural history, right? And one of them is Marxism, or Marxian analysis, right? But like instead people won't use the term Marxist. You hear people using the term cultural materialist or stuff like that, and it's like, yeah, you can say that, but it's still not, like it's not, you know. Anyway, I'm actually, yeah, the manifesto isn't an awesome intro text. I'll probably link articles in my org post through. Yeah. Like, that's all I'm saying. It's just like, just remember that like we need to always be cognizant of the fact that people need time to process these ideas, and they won't necessarily, and again, like that's always what I've always, like, this is why I've always, when I was in an organization back in Mexico, like that was our big thing. Like, we're not just gonna read theory, right? Like, because that doesn't work, right? Especially if we're talking to people that are part of the informal economy, right? Like, you can't you can't expect them to understand, the manifesto just by reading it through, right? Like, that's not. Instead, it's about questioning their assumptions, right? The stuff that they've been taught over time, right? Exactly. I'm actually trying to make these simplified explanation classes in my anti-MLM document because these people are so close to the point. Yeah, no, I totally get that. Also, you don't have to like Karl Marx to do. Yeah, I know. I'm like, it's like saying like, oh, like because I was talking about class conflict, suddenly that means that it's like, oh yeah, like, you should I'm on the list of so many people that's going to be sent, that you can send to the ghost of McCarthy, right? And for the the un-American the House Committee on Un-American Activities or whatever it was. Like I wasn't even quoting Marx. I was quoting people that just use class analysis. And even if I did quote Marx, there would have been something from his economic text, not even from his. Because like a lot of the stuff that I've sent in, so to speak, to be published, or to at least be considered, a lot of it is like based deeply in economics anyway. Like, that's why when I say cultural historian, I say that because it's like those are like that intermeshes with so many other things, right? I've mentioned, like, my work is by nature inter and transdisciplinary, right? It was never like there's no pigeonholing, right? Like that can't happen in cultural studies, because the whole point is that you cannot look at the history of, say, race in America and think of it as X and Y, right? Like, you just can't do that because there's so many complications to that idea. But yet when we're taught this, like in school, like people like to make it seem like, oh, it's just about skin color, or it's just about, and this is not even taking into account who they're saying it to, right? Like, to whom it is being addressed to, right? Like, people will try to say it's just a skin color thing, as a way to sort of say, again, to keep the ideas of white supremacy upheld, right? Especially in an aesthetic sense, right? Like, this is why you see people who aren't necessarily hogs, but they will have a reaction to when they do a show, right? Like, Bridgerton or whatever it's called, I forget. But it has, like, black nobility, right? And they have a huge issue with that because they're like, oh, in the actual book. And it's like, you know what I mean? It's like, that's not the point. I mean, like, they have no problem when it's a white person playing, like, whatever, right? But it's just this kind of like view that there's like this default that you have to keep to all the time, and so that's like I mean, already with that, right? You have to question all of those things. Why is it that people think there's a default? Why is it? How is it that default came to be, right? How is that default quote unquote upheld, right? And it's done by, again, all of the apparatuses that liberalism and capitalism has. I mean, that's just how it works. Like, that's the reason why when people try to say like, oh, people are gonna say that even history is racist as such, right? It's like, yes, historically speaking, the writing, or rather historiography, I should say, has been racist because it's taken the assumption of the idea that white people are the neutral party, and that everything is happening to them, right? Like they are just witnessing it. And that's not how history works, right? And so that's why, like, my own stuff, it's like looking at people's, I mean, this is why I have to translate so much, right? Like, I have to look at it how the people affected actually saw it. Like for example, the Afro-Mestizos that were dispossessed in Texas, that then they were almost going to be put into, like, they ran the risk of being enslaved, right? Essentially by the Anglos, the Americans that had moved into Texas, because they decided that they were going to break the very treaty they had just signed in 1848, and not give people citizenship. Was that they viewed them as doubly unworthy of citizenship because they were mixed with indigenous blood and with African blood. Right, but that idea of blood is also a thing we also have to question, right? Like, like, I know it seems complex and abstract, but like when you just think of indigenous people as this like very nebulous concept, I mean, that's something that comes straight out of the 19th century. That's why in the literature, right, you have something like The Last of the Mohicans feeding into this idea that the native peoples of particularly the United States are going extinct. And to a great extent, that is still happening. Like, they still do that. They want to view the indigenous peoples of the America as something in the past, something that is no longer present, right? And that is done on a systemic level. Like, not only where they decided to place the reservations, but even the idea of the reservations themselves, right? Because it was meant to limit their ability for self-determination, for self-preservation, etc. Then you also have all these other aspects too, like the fact that the idea of legal whiteness existed. Well, who did it apply to, right? And why is it that even people that aren't white, considered today, or weren't considered white then, are considered right? There are all these questions that have to be, so that, and you don't really get to do that if you don't do a lot of this analysis from it. And so that's why, that one of the complaints being that, we need histories that come from BIPOC, from queer people, etc. It's like, obviously, right? Like, it's not even a thing. It's like, how would you thank you for all the nodding. Thank you. Yeah, Marx just developed the method. Yeah, exactly. Like, Marx is just talking about dialectics, and even then, even then, it's built off of, people before him, like Hegel, the influence of Feuerbach, right? And then before that, I mean, you could even go back to the classical Greek tradition when it comes to Aristotle, right, in particular, right, in his De Rhetorica, right? And even Cicero, etc., right? Like, the idea of the dialectic has been something that's existed for thousands of years in the Western tradition, or the so-called Western tradition. But then that's why when you have someone like Cedric Robinson, who took Marx's method and then applied it in the ideas of Black Marxism, that is to say, how do we take in these categories of race and look at it, particularly aspects of the idea of rationalization of the economy? Why is it that, all of the ideas of what a communist society will be are always a European view, right? Like, oh, the communist world will essentially be like a Western Europe, just everywhere, right? Like that's one of the things that Cedric Robinson critiques, right? That it's like, no, that's not the case, right? Like even people that are MLs will say, oh, eventually the whole world will become like X, right? And that's not how that works. Like that's literally imperialism and the products of colonialism. It's not something like innate in communism, right? So, or in socialism in general. But yeah, historical, yeah, and I mean the economics aspect too. The Ferret King. It's like you cannot have modern economics. Like even modern economists have to answer what Marx wrote. Like because again, like Das Kapital or Capital, and even the other things that he wrote, right, that are specifically about economics. Some of them don't even necessarily talk about politics as such, right? It's more that because Marx wrote them, people imbue the political part into them, which is fine, that's whatever, but it just goes to show that it's like people like to act as though because Marx wrote Capital and essentially explained the idea of like what would later become described as like the velocity of money and the movement of commodity fetishism, like suddenly, oh, you can create an economics that does not include that. It's like, no, they still have to think about like today, the fact that people still are like that people can have their entire fortunes made or ruined by commodities themselves goes back to the idea of commodity fetishism. Like that's the whole point. Although I have heard some really interesting takes about how like now there's this idea of money fetishism, right? Now like people think money itself is this has that quality, right? The qualia that Marx writes about in the third chapter or the second chapter of part 1 of Capital, right? So again, it's not that Marx is irrelevant, right? It's just that they want to equate him just with the Soviet Union and its demise as opposed to the method of economics, right? It's like pretty much everyone should know, like Milton Friedman is wrong, just like whatever he says, just like it's wrong. Like especially when he says things like, oh, the question of inflation is a question of money. Literally that's not even true. Like that's just not how inflation works. Yeah, I hate Milton Friedman. Like he's like one of the worst, because the only reason why he even became well known was because of that if they want to abandon Marx, let them, but first they gotta prove him wrong first, and I don't think. See, the problem is that they can't. The problem is that they can't, because like what he wrote about commodity fetishism, the movement of money, right, which then sparks the discussion of the velocity of money, right, which is the idea of like how many transactions in relation to the money, money itself. Is that they want to view things too simplistically, right? Like they want to take away that aspect and say, if I have $4 and I buy 4 loaves of bread from 4 different bakers, it must be that each loaf of bread costs $1, right? Because that's very basic, but like bourgeois economists want to make it so that like everything fits this perfect mathematic equation, but it doesn't, right? It's like, as much as you want to toy or say that like we can tell what the velocity of money is in every instance, you don't, because we do not know how many transactions happen, right? Like, because especially when we live in a neoliberal world where everything is transactional, right? And this is not even taking into account like Bourdieu's idea of like social capital, right? Or cultural capital. Like these are separate, right? And we're not even considering those. We're just looking at particularly M0, right? That's to say, because there are 4 categories of money: M0, M1, M2, and M3. And so M0 is coins and bills. And so, like, if you just look at M0, people can say, oh, this much has happened, blah blah blah. Like this is where you get a lot of people saying that like most of the money that has ever been printed in American history happened now, like in the past, since 2020, when that isn't true. They want to do that because they believe what Friedman says, and what older economists have said, that inflation is a rapid increase in money supply, and it's not. It's a consistent and constant increase in prices. So I haven't tackled capital yet. I may never. I mean, like, I think so in Spanish, it's really interesting. In Spanish, they actually made, instead of having, like the big thick editions that they have, instead they cut them into, or not cut them, but made more books that show up, like there are more books of capital, so to speak, right? But they're all part 1, part 2, but they're smaller, and instead they focus on just like up until Marx is done talking about, this one section, right, where he's talking about what's a commodity, what is the commodity's relation to money, blah blah blah, and then he's talking about something else, right? That's a separate book, right? Yeah, it does make a lot more sense, like I understand, people are like, oh, it's more books, but I'm like, yes, but it's also much more digestible, because there are some things that are like, are deeply in the weeds, right? And it's like, that's something that you could, but like the first part, right, is kind of like super important, right? Yeah, like, and so in Mexico, there's this leftist, or definitely much more leftist than any book publisher I've ever seen in America. Like, I mean, that is to say, like they seem even more left than Verso, right? Whose name means left, right, in Latin. But the point being that they published that series of books of Marx's Capital, and it's instead of being just like the whole book, it's split up by theme and aspect, right? Like, okay, well, here we're talking about commodity and commodity production. Here we're talking about like how money, like the story of money, the history of money, how it interacts, how it's used. Then the next part is blah blah blah, right? It's just makes more sense. Because another thing too is, like, in terms of history, right? Like, I might have to do part 1, right, about commodities. But when Marx does go into like more historical discourse, right, that's something that I would choose, more than any, particularly like the parts where it's just like math equations, right, going in over and over and over. But yeah, Ludwig Feuerbach, yeah, that's good. And The End of Classical German Philosophy, oh, that one's good too. I always liked, is it the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right? That one is really good, especially because, actually, that is really good. It's, Miss Frizzle, you might be interested in that, because that's actually where, I think it's Engels. I want to say it's Engels. I might be wrong on that. But it's in the Philosophy of Right, that's where that's where Hegel discusses education. And that's where the preeminence of the idea of, like, so America took the idea of like a Prussian education, right, or at least vaguely, right. I would say now it's, vaguely, you can sort of see the connections, right. But in that, and in the critique of that, they specifically are going against what Hegel says, because he essentially fetishizes, right, in the Marxist sense, the idea of the Prussian state, that because it's a state apparatus that is one, bourgeois, but also at the same time, as also, I guess, one way to put it is that the state already has its the institutional aspects of that state, right? That, like, oh, who will be in the civil service because there's only one way to get there, right? You will know who will be in blank because they have to do this, right? And so there's an aspect in the Philosophy of Right, which, again, I mean, you could also read that and although I don't think it's necessary to read the Philosophy of Right. I mean, it's one of the shorter Hegel texts, I'll say that for sure. It's not the Phenomenology of the Spirit. That's a whole different thing. Like, for that, I always recommend people read it with, like, either one of those books that's like explaining, what are they called, introductions to the book or whatever, or that they read it in a reading group, right? Because otherwise it's like Hegel just has this way of like writing entire pages of words, and then suddenly you realize that there was like you have to read it again and again, because it's just like, I don't even know what you just said, bro. Like, I have no idea what you just said. At least that's like with that book for sure. You're trying to finish Mutual Aid, but I'm also reading another book too. Oh, which? Oh, I mean, if you want to say which book that is. Right now, I'm reading. Well, I'm actually looking through this book that's looking at the history of like anti-Jewishness in the idea, or like the West, right? Like in terms of history, right? And so that's kind of one of those things. It's the pest, how humans create it, and okay, interesting. Yeah, the one I'm looking at is titled Anti-Judaism: The Western Tradition by David Nirenberg, and it's sort of going into how there already was this historical tradition of anti-Judaism that people kind of, like, once the term anti-Semitism comes into existence, right, which was brought into existence so that then they could discriminate against Jewish people on racial lines as opposed to religious lines, as they did historically. Well, I mean, at least to say that the basis of their supposed difference was religious anyway. Because I would say definitely with Spain, right, and even with England, you already have this idea of like racializing Jewishness, right? So it's looking at that idea from like the beginnings of what is like the early European Christian tradition, right? Like once Europe is considered its own separate, space, I guess is one way to think of it, in the early Middle Ages. Oh, it's all heavy. I've been reading a lot of research online about evangelical attitudes on climate change. Oh, that must be interesting. Yeah, like for me, the worst thing like when I was researching evangelical stuff at one point, it was to I was trying to look at the history of the Origin of the Family. That one's really good. I really like I've brought it up like so many times on stream now, where I talk about how like that part where he's saying like when people are reading the Bible, right, and he uses this example, which I think is a really good example, and he's talking, and people read the word family, they imagine it to be exactly like the way how families exist today, right? In his case, the late 19th century, but in our case, right, the beginning, actually, well, I guess almost the middle of the 21st century. But point being that people still do that with a lot of things, right? Like people act like race and all these other things go back to time immemorial when they don't. That's one of the big aspects that I guess that's actually a big challenge right now, but especially since identity as a concept is being politicized, particularly in a very negative way, right? Like it's not only people having their identities reified by right wingers, right? So being seen as a thing, right, as a separate thing, as opposed to being part of human experience, right? But also how that allows for the creation of certain myths, right, that fuel, for example, again, not to fall into, say, the thing of saying one is the other. Okay, see you soon, Ferret King. And that is that of course, sometimes I'll listen to the readings on YouTube. Oh, by chapter? Yeah, exactly. Like, that's why I like the Mexican capital, right? Yes, drive safe. Because I like it since it's like, if you just read that first part, you can take your notes on that and you can learn it really, really well before you move on to the next book. And yes, it does multiply the books you have to buy, but it's one books those like that the leftist publishers in Mexico tend to already charge a lot less than the average, right? Like than the average commercial publisher for that, especially because they're aimed at academics, right? And so they're aimed at and like the bookshop I would go to that sells these texts, like they sell used and new, so you could buy, like that's one of their big things is like they will they have no problem taking the books back and reselling them, right, as used books. And I like that because in Mexico, and I don't know if this is exactly the same across Latin America, but in my experience, like in Mexico, like if you want a new book, oftentimes it'll still be wrapped in plastic, right? Like you have to buy it in order to open it up. Like you can't even leaf through the book to look at it, right? So one thing I always liked about that bookstore is that they did the opposite. They're like, that's done in this, way to kind of like stop the reader from having access to the, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's essentially what you do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because there's another bookstore that I like that what it did is that it took a lot of like the classics, right? Like stuff that's already, in that's already like free according to Mexican law, right? It's now public domain, which is much sooner than American law, right? And so then like if there are things you want to buy that are like even much more recent writers, they publish it so that way they can lower the price, and they also do the whole exactly what you described. Like if you sell it back to them, right, like they give you credit and you can use it there. Some people are making really good zines as well, and a lot of them are very affordable, if not free, and anarchist books. That reminds me, I meant to send someone a book about anarchism. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because remember I've said before that like Zionists have sort of taken stuff away from the Jewish people, right? They've stolen it, right? And one of the things that they stole actually were kibbutzim, right? Which are these like communal farming. Sometimes they could be communal, industrial, or have some things like that. But most of them typically in the beginning used to be agricultural, right? And one of the things was that, and this is like these people that initially went to Palestine. Were not there to colonize. Like they were not Zionists, right? And so when the Zionists tried to essentially steal their way of living and to create their own kibbutzim, but they did it so to buy land with the explicit purpose of later on dispossessing the people that lived on it or that lived next to it, etc., right? There actually was an anarchist resistance because that became a big thing, was this anarchist kibbutzim movement that most people just never read about, because again, like Israeli history, right, so to speak, is written by Zionists, obviously, and so they erased the fact that there ever was any dissent, right, even in the land of Palestine. So there's that, right? I wanted to talk about that book because I think it's important for people to know that it's like, obviously now that the state of Israel has been quote unquote founded, it's a whole different story. But that the kibbutzim started off as not seeking that, and that there was a large anarchist tradition that went against that and was actively fighting against it. And instead wanted to, be part of Palestine as opposed to a Zionist state, I think is important to at least, talk about in the historical context. Let me see here. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting too because I always feel that people are way too willing to forget things like that. Like I don't know I don't know how else to put it, but like yeah, to forget things like that and act like, they're well, especially because again, like what people are taught is the Zionist version of history, right? And so of course they don't want to recognize the fact that people resisted it. And actively tried to, not be part of it, right? Let's see here. I'm trying to find the video that I want. Oh my god! So there's this one video that I don't know. I've never watched it. I haven't watched it, but it says YouTube science scam crisis, and I think I got it because I think you were talking about MLMs and like scams and stuff, Miss Frizzle. Now I'm like, should I talk about that or bring it up? Like, it would be a cool thing to talk about. And then I did want to talk about Equatorial Guinea. The problem is that the video is in Spanish. So I don't know if people would be willing to watch it. Because otherwise I'm more than willing to. Like if people are willing to watch it.
Estamos aquí.
Oh wait. Cause just one second. So I wanted to show this video because I think often people forget. Okay, yeah. Then after this video, I'll bring up the sign scam one. Okay. I'm just gonna show a little bit of this one anyway, so it's not gonna be the main video anyway. So but I wanted to talk about. Oh my gosh! Thank you so much, Adidak, for the tier 1 subscription. Wow, 6 months. Thank you so much. So this one that we're gonna look at is Equatorial Guinea. Hi, Adidak, how are you? Which is the only recognized country in Africa, because it used to be a Spanish colony. So it's the only recognized country in Africa that speaks Spanish. And a lot of people in Latin America often forget that there are places right outside of Latin America that also speak Spanish, or even a Spanish Creole language like Chabacano in the Philippines, right? So I wanted to sort of like bring this up because I think it's a part of like Spanish speaking culture, right? Latinx culture, like sort of in a broad view, right? That oh, no worries. It's okay if you just lurk out of that. Take, whatever you need to do.
Es una especie de colaboración que voy a estar haciendo con EPRO. Vamos a estar hablando en este vídeo sobre curiosidades históricas de Guinea Ecuatorial relacionadas con España.
So, what this is going to be, it's going to be a short video. It's only 8 minutes of historic curiosities of Equatorial Guinea related to Spain.
Sin nada más que decir, empezamos.
Hola familia de YouTube, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, sea el lugar donde se encuentre. Mi nombre es Epifanio Baril Bestué, el propietario del canal EPRO, un canal dedicado a la historia de África en general y en particular Guinea Ecuatorial, tanto en las tradiciones como en la cultura. Espero que sea de vuestro agrado y les sugiero que se suscriba a los dos canales, que esto nos ayuda bastante para seguir adelante con nuestra labor.
Durante la época colonial, la ciudad de Santa Isabel, actualmente conocida como Malabo, bueno, anteriormente se llamaba Santa Isabel, la ciudad fue fundada por los españoles en 1827 y actualmente...
So the city that is now the... I'd be curious to see you look into MLMs in Mexico. There was a creator that's bilingual anti-MLM content because she's seen a lot of MLMs created in migrant communities. Recently, an immigration lawyer got outed for recruiting his client. Oh my gosh. No, yeah, there is a big problem in the, like, here in LA, that there's a really big problem with that, where it's like I actually remember because they like wanted to invite my mom at the time to go, and like my mom is not that type of person, like has always been very averse to that. But like, oh my gosh, it was just. And then so there used to be this bookstore that had that was like also had a huge. Yay! I'm so glad you made it home safely, Ferret. So glad you made it home safely. So I was at this bookstore in LA that has like a space, right, for like events in the back, and the bookshelves that are kind of like right along where like the little passageway kind of like makes one of the walls of the space as well. They were like that's where all of their like Spanish magazines were, and I was like looking at it, Spanish language magazines, and literally I was like just hearing what they were saying, and like right away I'm like, that's one of those like MLMs. Like right away I could just tell. One of the big tells, especially if they're in the Latinx community, is when they say the word brother. It like in that way, in like Spanglishy kind of way. They always want to say, I don't know why, they always want to say the word brother. They always say, oye brother, hoy les voy a dar una información sobre blah 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 blah, right? But they always want to use the word brother, and I've just noticed like every time that I've ever heard, like, and it's usually because it's some dude, of course, like they always want to use that thing like brother, right? Like I don't know why they do that. It's just really weird to me. Yeah, like that's always one of those tells. It's like they want to use that language. Oh, well, that's so lucky for you, Ferret, that you live only 7 minutes away. Like, for me, like, if I wanted to go on campus, it's a long drive. It's long drive.
Lleva el nombre de Malabo. Esa Santa Isabel viene del nombre de la...
So, what he's saying is that the capital city of what is now Equatorial Guinea used to be called Santa Isabel, but it was named after the Queen of Spain at the time, Queen Isabel.
Reina Isabel II de España.
En cuanto al Tratado del Pardo de 1778, debemos tener en cuenta que ese tratado se empezó desde 1777, en donde Portugal le correspondía hacer intercambio con España sobre las islas de Fernando Po y Annobón, mientras que los portugueses daban a España las islas de Santa Catarina. Y ahí fue el punto de partida de España para con sus territorios del Golfo de Guinea, netamente hoy en día Guinea Ecuatorial.
Después de la guerra de España con...
So what they're saying is like sort of going over the process that like in Europe, they like Portugal and Spain essentially decided like, okay, well, like if you want these islands here, I'll give them to you, but you have to give me this over here. So it's like literally like viewing, you know, their colonies like, you know, things that they can just inter-exchange for whatever reason it might be, right?
Contra Marruecos entre 1859 y 1860. España utilizó a soldados y prisioneros de guerra marroquíes para mantener y establecer su presencia aquí en Guinea Ecuatorial.
Al final del siglo XIX, grandes...
And so, what was just said is that in the late 18th century, or rather in the 19th century, you have this this rebellion that essentially the Spanish, because like the Spanish ended up... Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Ferret King. Yes. Oh, thank you so much for the subscription to Sarah. Thank you so much. And yes, now we're one... Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Ferret King, for the tier 1 subscription to Miss Frizzle. Oh, that is so sweet. We're almost there. We're 1/5 of the way there. Let's see here. We call each other comrades at my org. That's good. Do you know what they're usually selling? A typical financial service, I wonder. Sometimes yes. Like, I've noticed that there's been a big thing of trying to sell people land that they, like, haven't seen yet, right? So there's that. Like, oh, invest in land out here, right? And it's like... like realistically speaking, they probably won't ever build anything on that land anyway. But that's kind of how they try to sell it to them. It's like, oh, well, it's an investment. It's going to go up in value, blah, blah, blah. And all you have to do is just, pay this. And so there's that, like actually buying real estate. And a lot of it also revolves around like, like the typical stuff where you have to sell stuff away, right? There's that too. So you have to take on debt, right? In order to then sell to more and more people and get more and more people involved, right? So, product-based MLMs are the ones that I guess can come to mind more. But the financial ones, the ones that are based on like real estate or investing in XYZ thing, that's the one where that guy was like, brother, mira, les voy a dar una información aquí, blah, 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 right? It's like, ustedes son un grupo único, like literally trying to make them seem like they were really special, right? Pyramid schemes, yeah. I just learned MLM means pyramid scheme. Yeah, MLMs. Well, see, like the problem is like MLM can mean like a Maoist, like a non-Gonzaloist Maoist, but it also means multi-level marketing. So this one anti-MLM creator was like, I had to clarify to everyone on TikTok that I wasn't anti-men loving men. Oh my gosh. Trading call, yeah, pretty much, yeah. Cooking up the homies. Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Ferret. And Adadak, of course. Do you think the Shining Path are real MLMs? Well, Sarah, let me put it to you in this sense, right? The people that actually identify with the Shining Path usually are MLMPM. Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, principally Maoists. And I know, of course, the left, they have to split off and create. The division is this. What did Gonzalo contribute in terms of theory and praxis, right? Some people will say, oh, I'm so sorry about that, sir. I hope, I'm not trying to, the ones that typically identify as MLM, as the base, so to speak, typically tend to focus more on the Filipino revolution that's ongoing, and the one going on in India, right? Those are the two revolutionary areas, I guess, of where theory has been written, right, by Jose Sison. Joma, right, as he was called, Jose Maria Sison, I should say, and then with the Naxalites, right, so which is again typically focused on the peasantry, is one way of focusing on that, because that's kind of like Mao's, like that's kind of what MLM see as like the difference between an ML and an MLM, is that the focus is also looking at seeing how the peasantry itself could be a revolutionary class too. Right, like it's not like proletarianization will happen, so why act as though like the how is it that we can make sure that the low, or I guess like Mao kind of divides up the peasantry into like a wealthier peasantry, right, that might own land, right, and then rent it out, but they're still tied to the land itself. Like they work the land too, they just have some extra land that they can rent out, and then, or whatever, or like the peasantry that's absolutely landless, right, that's completely tied to whatever it might be, in a condition of servitude of some sort, right? So that's where Maoists, particularly like the MLMs, the ones that focus on the Philippines, China's, revolution, and the one in India that's ongoing, as the preeminent examples, right? Like, we're at a higher stage now because, like, everything's changed since 1917, right? Like, 1949, when China, finally defeats the nationalists, right? Like, now we've entered a new era where again, you have a Mao that focuses on the peasantry, right? And that's kind of why I went over the people's communes, because I think to me that's kind of like at the heart of MLMs, as opposed to MLMPMs who focus more on, like, interesting enough, they become very concerned and very, I almost want to say obsessed, but maybe I won't go that far. But they definitely are very interested in PPW, right? Protracted People's War. Like, that's what they focus on, instead of thinking like, what about everything else? Like, literally everything else, right? Like, how, like, it's I don't want to necessarily give like the Parenti line, like, the revolution that feeds the children is the one that, is the one that's important. But yes, like, also that's true, right? Like, it's not just tactics, right? It's kind of like how with like centrist, quote unquote, right? Everything is about optics. It's like, not everything is about tactics, right? Like, that's not like, if everything is always read through the lens of war, then like, what about everything else that isn't in war, right? They are a thing, or they were a thing, particularly in the early 90s, right? Like, that's when they were doing their shutting off the power of Lima. Supposedly they took over like 60% of the country or whatever. But that's all, like, even MLMPMs I've met have been kind of like, well, like, it's nice to, they think this, right? I'm not saying this. They think, well, it's nice, the idea that they could have had owners, quote unquote, like, owned or been in 80 or whatever percent of the land, but it doesn't really follow. Like, it's like, oh, like, maybe they had an incident in this part of Peru, but it doesn't mean that it's now I'm forgetting. In Peru, they're called departamentos, right? The smaller divisions of the country, right there. You've changed. I don't see, like, like that, like all of that stuff, like what happened in gosh, now I'm forgetting the name. Not Cochabamba. That's in Bolivia. Why am I forgetting? Lunamarca. What happened in Lunamarca, like, that's not something that I don't think anybody should identify with. I think, to me, what happened there was a huge, like, discrediting of Gonzalo, and should have been a sign that, people might want to see him as very revolutionary and whatever. And if you read what he wrote, there are some interesting parts here and here, because he went to China, right, during the Cultural Revolution and saw it and said, but, like, again, I think that, again, like, this is why I think that not only should people remember, like, don't know book worship, right, from what Mao says, but also, like, don't, worship, like the people that identified with Stalin alone, right? It's like, that's not really what you're supposed to be doing as a Marxist, right, or as a leftist. It's like Stalin, right? Like that is not the end all be all of that. Like, the whole point is that, like, we learn from the mistakes and take the best aspects from it, and then apply that later. Yeah, exactly. Don't treat it like the Bible, so to speak. Yeah, it's not gospel. But yeah, I agree. It was wrong for them to do, like, what happened in Lucanamarca is just reprehensible. And again, like, even the parts where they're like, oh, like, it's the CIA that said that, right? It's like, fine. Like, even if that's true, the parts that even you admit to doing are still bad. You know what I'm saying? Like, because they often will try to say, well, like, there are parts that, like, oh, the CIA or whatever, or like their Fujimori, like, admitted to saying that it was made up, but, like, everything else they did that they've admitted to is still bad. Like, so yeah. And then now, like, the movement as it exists now particularly works in the Vrayem Valley, right? Well, the V stands for valley, but you know what I mean. In the Vrayem area in Peru. And so, like, now they're known to be, like, in the narcotics trade, right? Yeah, some situations are just really bad, right? And it's like, especially when you're dealing with, when there's, like, a class component, a racial component, right? And you don't read into that, and you don't think about the fact that, like, here you have all of these indigenous people that are part of the peasantry, that are putting their lives on the line for, a white Peruvian person that gets to live in hiding in Lima, right? it it brings up a lot of questions, right? That I think Marxists should always have, right? Like, sometimes I wonder during the Shining Path Uprising too if maybe the government did some tactic things to make. Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I would say that, there are, like, what are they called? Like the Gamonales, or I can't remember. I think I want to say they're called the Gamonales, but like the way how they would govern those areas, right? Because they were for the most part abandoned by the state. Definitely made left a power vacuum for sure, right? Like it left it where if either side gives you authority, right? Like a lot of authoritarianism as such, right? That, oh yeah, like they're right because that's what, like you only have the choice between two, the ones that have been doing this or the ones that are saying that they're going to do this, right? It's like, well, which ones do you choose? But also another thing too is like during the presidency of Velasco, right? Like this is another thing too that I think MLMs are much more focused on generally than a lot of Marxist-Leninists. But I would say this is mostly the case because when I say Marxist-Leninist, I mean in the West, right? In particularly in the United States. Is that they don't think about the idea of land reform, right? And the idea of like how that has to be a central thing. And that again comes from more of a Maoist perspective of looking at how like the peasantry, right, especially in these semi-feudal, semi-colonial countries like Peru, Mexico, etc. It's like you have to have land reform. Like you can't do what they did in the United States where like, oh yeah, for 5 years, they had Reconstruction, and then in one go they could get rid of it all and, just reproduce the system in a new way, right? So there's, that's a huge critique that Mao brings up. So that again just wasn't a thing in Russia because they had quote unquote freed the serfs, but it's not like they gave the serfs land, right? But during the Velasco government in Peru, like that's when this Shining Path became really active. And that's when he was doing land reforms, and he was willing to work with more left-leaning than any of the other presidents. And then that caused a big, then because of a lot of the violence and everything that was going on due to the Shining Path, etc. That's why the military felt okay toppling his government, right? Like they're like, oh well, you have these people rioting or rebelling out here. So we can use that as justification to get rid of this guy. And then that's how you get Fujimori, right? Like in 1990. So it's like... so again, I'm very cognizant of this history, which is why I am, I've always been much more of the this the belief that people will say, oh, it was good for them to... I'd never run for president here. You want to go... Well, I mean, we'll see, the thing is that, Mexico has a really weird thing where it's, for 70 years, we had a dictatorship that, technically every 6 years they would choose someone to be, the representative of. But, even the United States knew there was, a junta of people behind, as it were, the presidency that was... I mean, that's true. All of them are, right? Especially in the imperialist countries. And the ones that are seen as acceptable in imperialized countries are the ones that are comprador bourgeoisie. So, of course, that's why... it's like I said, when I was... this actually happened when I was living... when I was taking, a class on government in high school, where they were trying to say, Mexico, yeah, it was a one-party state, but it's different than, the Soviet Union or China or whatever. It's different because they were willing to essentially let themselves be imperialized by the US. So they're so that's the difference, the difference is that they were very, very open to the US. So it's it's this way of saying yeah, we like dictators when they're our friends, right? And it was just a really weird thing. It's how are you saying Cuba's horrible because it's a one-party state, and I've heard legit stories that just make no sense, in stuff that just doesn't even make sense. They're in Cuba they make people do XYZ, and it's just you can't even get people to do that in quote unquote free countries, let alone quote unquote, communist countries, right? Or, at least as they view communism, right? So I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And I'll never forget finding out when I was younger. Oh my gosh, when I found out that the CIA wanted to literally stage the second coming of Christ to overthrow the Castros. That to me was like, okay, CIA, like, that I would pay to see. Like, that is like, okay, like, let's see you try to do that. I want to see you try to stage the second coming of Christ. I want to see that. Because I just kept thinking, like, okay, like, at this point in history, right, like, I'm thinking about, like, CGI and blah, blah, blah. But then I'm thinking, well, this has to be public, right? Like, they can't do all of that. It's not like they can, like, have a movie and say, oh, this is what happened, right? So I'm thinking, like, yeah, I would love to see the budget. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Yokio, for the tier 1 subscription. 7 months. Wow, thank you. But yeah. Hello. We stole Jesus and put him in here. Pretty much. I mean, that's kind of what it felt like. Like, they legit were gonna, like, send, like, planes and everything. And, like, we will show you the video, though. Yeah. Pretty much. That tomb is empty, all right. Yeah, no, it was just so weird because it's like, imagine reading this and, you've heard all of these horrible things about Cuba. And then you're thinking, like, wait a second, like, why would they need to do that, right? And then, then my second thought is, like, I would pay to watch that. Like, it's like, I want a one-way, I want to, like, I need a ticket to Havana right now. Like, I need it right now. I want to watch this, right? But yeah, like, to me, that was just, like, that they were going to have, like, hidden fog machines and all of this stuff. I'm like, were they going to, like, invent this stuff? Like, I'm thinking, like, that's how much they hate, the socialism that's being created in Cuba, right? Because, again, I always say socialism is a process as opposed to, like, a state of being, so to speak, right? Like, it's not something that, like, oh, you reach it and then... Who was going to play Jesus? Watch it be someone like, I don't know. I'm trying to think, like, oh gosh, who would they cast as Jesus? Who has the most Jesus looking? Well, of course. Oh yeah, definitely a white dude. But I'm trying to think, like, who looks most Jesus like, right? Because and they also can't be like super. Well, I guess they could be well known, but it just doesn't make sense, right? Like, I'm trying to think, like. Arnold, I told you I did that. Arnold Schwarzenegger, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine him being the second coming of Christ. I've come back for you, just like... hidden, they were going to do hidden fog machines, because the whole point is, they were going to have a descent from the sky of Jesus. Like the different ideas they had was, they were going to have this, like, in Havana, right? Like, they thought, okay, we're going to stage the second coming of Christ. And then Cubans are going to be like, then Jesus is going to say, like, overthrow the government. And then everyone's going to be like, oh, shit, it's Jesus. We have to do it, right? And that was their whole plan. Like, legit, like, we're going to stage this. So they were going to hide in, like, submarines, like, all of these, like, mist machines and all these things that were going to happen, right? To make this huge event, right? And then they were going to have, like, lights and everything, right? Like, it was going to be, like they already planned, like, okay, it would only work between September 23rd and September 27th or what. Like, I don't know. Like, they had already had it all planned out. And then they said no at the last minute because they were like, oh, the budget's going to be too much or whatever reason. I'm like, I like how the budget is what was the issue, right? Not like we're staging the second coming of Christ to overthrow, like, a perfectly regular, like the way how I think about Cuba is, like, if it wasn't embargoed, it essentially would be the country that is most like, say, I mean, I don't want to compare it to, but, like, in terms of its social programs, is most like, right, like, the New Testament, right? Yeah. Like, I would have loved to have watched this. Like, I would have loved to have watched this too, because it's just like, I'm thinking, like, okay, so they're gonna send people there, right, as well, right? They're gonna be people in the audience that are gonna try to, like, whip up revolution against the government, right? And that was their plan, to literally stage the second coming of Christ. And I'm just like, I really wish this could have happened, but they were all like, oh no, we have to tighten our belts, we have to, like keep our fiscal house in order, which is such a lie. That's such a lie. Damn it, we're over budget, we're gonna need to give up Pizza Wednesday, but I love Pizza Wednesday. It's either Pizza Wednesday or Inside a Holy War in Cuba. Exactly! That's exactly what they were like. Yes, then they're gonna essentially do like anti-communist, crusade or jihad against the government, right? Like, it's like, no. Like, I just don't get what their thinking was. Like, I'm trying to think, like, okay, I know that, like the church is allowed in Cuba. I don't know why people act like everyone's an atheist. It's just that most Cubans get a university education, and that has been an indicator that leads to a reduction in the amount of people who are very fervent believers in religion. Doesn't mean they all are not believers, but that just happens as a consequence of that. And so, or at least people see some kind of relationship. I can't say correlation, but a relationship of some sort, right? And I'm just trying to think, like, what did they think? Like, seems like might be less appetite for holy war when you have access to medical care, right? Medical care, and another thing too is like everybody has the right to food, everyone has the right to water, everyone has the right to a house. Like, I don't know, like that's why I'm saying, like, to me, it's like if Cuba wasn't embargoed, it would probably be able to actually be a country that most seems like the social democracies in the Nordic countries, at least in the sense that like they would finally be able to do all of the development that they've wanted to do without having to pander to the United States and tourism as much as they have had to do, right? Like that's that's how the United States has tried to liberalize their economy, was by doing the whole tourism thing, right? Like, oh, well, since we're going to keep embargoing you, but except for tourism, then, like, that's a way to get, small businesses back into the economy. Seems like might be less, yeah, I mean, the most appealing thing about Jesus is that he gives free healthcare and tuna. Also wine, yes. If like, the one thing I like about Jesus is, is like, if you invite him to your wedding, he will just like take, like those big 5-gallon things of water and just turn it into wine. He's like, you know what? I don't want you to have to go to Bevmo or to wherever, right? I'm gonna give you. I'm just gonna give you whatever you want. It's like, if you want wine, it's wine, or if you want it to be, Everclear, Jesus wanted everyone to rage. I mean, yes, I totally believe that. Occasionally he'll do a resurrection too, just for the lulz. Pretty much, yeah. One thing I like too is the fact that the people that report his resurrection, nobody believes them. But yet somehow that's how they start building up the whole religion on that. Like, oh yeah, there's no way that anyone would ever believe these two women. But also, it happened. Like, it's kind of a weird thing. It is hilarious. Like, they're like, oh yeah, implied in that is the fact that don't believe them, but also, like, what they said was true anyway. Like, well, how would you know? Like, the whole point is they don't believe them. Like, oh, they're just these hysterical women, quote unquote, right? And it's just like, what? Like, that doesn't even. Okay, just sure, if you say so. And then like Jesus just like appears somewhere, right? Like, isn't Chaltavor, right? Like in like he just appears in northern Israel for no reason, or what is like now considered, like in the north of Palestine, on Mount Tabor, right? And that's when they have Pentecost. My favorite is all the trust in Paul. Oh yeah, like Paul, the guy who was a Roman citizen, and literally just was never Jewish. I mean, like, there's no way that, like, as much as they love to make it seem like, oh yes, he was Jewish, like, there's no way that he was Jewish. Like, he lived, like, he spoke Greek, and everything he ever wrote was in Greek, or whatever he supposedly wrote, right, was Greek. And then, like, the first manuscripts of the New Testament were all found in Syria. Where does he have his supposed, like, epiphanic episode? Southern Syria. Like, You know, it's like I don't know. And it's like I said before, like the issue is that you can tell that he doesn't understand Jewish theology because there are things that were already believed by the Second Temple times. So essentially, like the turn from BCE to CE, right? That were already like common in Jewish theology and Jewish thought. You know, and Jesus is supposedly supposed to be this expert, right? But then they don't. But then also they don't recognize that if he's an expert and he's talking with rabbis in the temple, then that means he's a Pharisee, right? You know what I mean? It's like it doesn't make any sense if you think about it, just like a few of the things, like why the hatred towards the Pharisees? I've been watching a bunch of stuff about all the Greek mimesis in the Bible, and the Christian apologists are so pissed by the idea that the writers of the holy texts would be influenced by Greek culture. I mean, there's just so much in there that's just like, it's so... Again, like, there was a video, I don't know if they took it down, maybe they did, but, or he took it down, I guess. And that is that there was a video that there used to be that actually went through all of the different... Like, there was a Jesus of Gamla, who was literally, like, his name was, again, you know, Jesus is just the Greek pronunciation of the name Yoshua, right? And Yoshua, or Yeshua, some people say, right, is supposed to be Jesus, but it's literally just the name Joshua. And that was chosen on purpose. But regardless, I kind of lost my train of thought. I completely forgot what I was going to say. Something about Joshua. Oh yeah, by Greek culture. Oh, you know, you had Jesus of Gamla, who in the year 6 CE literally did like almost exactly what Jesus of Nazareth is said to have done. Like almost exactly. Like even like the whole, like, he had to be Greek to see them abs. You see them abs. What I will say one thing is, like, the most religious Jewish people have always been averse to, like, the idea of, like, well, because, one, there's the idea of tzniut, or tznius, which is modesty, right? And unlike in Christianity, where modesty tends to be always focusing on women, modesty applies to both men and women, right? Obviously, it's, you know, there's also gender separation, of course, but... Like, it's the reason why you'll never see Orthodox Jewish men with a shirt that's shorter than their elbows, right? So it's, like, very different because they actually, like, apply the rules onto men, and that's not typically done in a lot of places. A bunch of Christian apologists saying Jewish teachings ban teaching your children Greek, therefore there is no Greek mimesis in the Bible, because... That doesn't even make sense, because again, all of the manuscripts, even the oldest ones, and even the people that commented on the people writing the manuscripts, all spoke Greek. And again, and they're not even in bad Greek; they're in good Greek. So that means that it's someone that was educated in Greek, right? So that's a huge problem. And again, it's also forgetting the fact that initially the Gospels began as sayings Gospels. It was just quotes of what Jesus said, right? Like, the story was added, like, after, like, in between the quotes. Like, oh, he said this, so let me write a story that fits this quotation, right? That's why you have two stories that are the same saying, but they take place in technically two different places, right? One of them being the Sermon on the Mount, which most people know, in the Gospel of Matthew, but then if you look at the Gospel of Luke, he's in an open field. It's like, well, so which is it? Is he on a mountain, or is he on a field? Like, those two things are mutually exclusive. Like, you know. Hi, Three Ghost, how are you? But yeah, like, that's just cope. I mean, that's just bad cope. And then again, like I said, like, when I talk to people that are Christian, like biblical scholars, like even they will say like, yeah, like the first things were Greek, and there isn't as much of a connection as people like to. Luke is a summary of the gospel. Well, yeah. Um, so Luke, took the manuscript of Matthew, which itself is based off the earliest gospel, which is the Gospel of Mark, and that's how they built up, right? And that's why they're called the synoptic gospels, because their narratives are the most they're intertwined in that way. But once you get to John, that's when you get, oh, I'm so glad to hear that you're doing well. Glad to hear that. So Matthew used Mark. Matthew used the Gospel of Mark, right? The Gospel of Matthew is based off the Gospel. That's why if you read Mark, it's the most, as it were, threadbare of all of the Gospels, right? It has the least amount of narrative, because it's when they were just adding narrative to it. And then you have Matthew, which adds in more religious elements, but they're Greek elements. That's the thing. Like, people always, like, I've heard people try to argue that Mark is so simple because it was aimed to a Jewish audience. And I'm like, well, it must have been some very interesting Jewish audience if it's all written in, like, really good Greek, right? And none of the stuff has ever been found south of the borders of Syria, right? Like, it's never been found in Syria, Palestina, which is, Palestine, right? And that's even including, like, the other side of the Jordan, etc. Like, nowhere in that area of what people consider to be the quote-unquote land of Israel, they've never found Christian stuff until after the fact. Like, after 300 years later, then you see things, as it were, popping up like that. But that's because you get conversion and settlement, right? But John is often called the Gnostic Gospel because of its John 1:1, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense to like, that literally makes no sense in Jewish thought, like that, like, because again, it's the idea of the logos, right? But the idea of the logos is literally, it's Greek. Definitionally, like, the only way to understand it is by understanding Greek philosophy, right? Not Jewish philosophy, and definitely not Jewish theology. Because that's not how that works. Like, the belief that, and then, of course, you have the idea of the Trinity. That just doesn't suit. You cannot have a triune Godhead. That just does not work in Judaism. One thing I really dislike, though, is I hate when they call them the Jewish Christians. I'm like, I get what they're trying to say, but I think they assume the Jewishness of the people, because Paul says there were people that were, caught up and said, like, oh, should we still, follow the kosher laws and stuff like that? But it's like, it becomes very clear that, like, that's kind of more of like an example as opposed to like a decision, right? Because very, very quickly, like in parts where you see Christians and Jews living in the same similar area in the empire, you can tell which houses were Jewish by, like even where they could have pork, for example. All the Jewish houses, which were always built in a certain area, right, historically speaking, you can see that they had no pork bones, right? Whereas in the Christian houses, you already see them consuming pork, like right away. So in like Anatolia. So again, it's like immediately you have the change over to a more Greek understanding of stuff. So because they do have this documentary on, is it PBS, that's called like From Jesus to Christ or something like that, where it goes over kind of like the first Christians, because it's essentially noting how, well, for one, that notion of Christos is a Greek concept. It has never existed in Jewish. It still doesn't exist in a Jewish concept at all. It's on YouTube. It's for free. Like, you can look it up. It's called From Jesus to Christ. It's all available on YouTube. Because since it's like the public broadcasting service, it always publishes all of its documentaries online for free. And so it has both parts. I think that they added a third part. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong. But I do know it's at least 2 parts. But it's going over that. And then, there were other people like Bart Ehrman, for example, that goes, sometimes he goes a little bit too deep and like trying to prove, quote unquote, that like Paul didn't write this or that. And I think that's kind of like, I get why people would do that, but I also think it's also kind of unnecessary sometimes. Like, or at least to like focus on that. Like, Paul didn't write this. Like, most people, a lot of people who are Christians don't even really, I guess, grasp the idea of the authorship of the Bible at all. And I know that that's kind of a weird thing to say, but it's more like it exists as a whole already, right? Like, so to view it in a fashion that's like, yeah, they don't, right? Exactly. And so that's kind of what I've noticed, especially if like more, I guess, like evangelical Christians, like to them it's like the Bible is, I don't want to, okay, I'm going to use this example because it's kind of how it feels like. Like, like when like the Death Note falls from like the Shinigami world, right? And then like you touch it and suddenly like now you can see Shinigami. Oh yeah, the History Channel has a channel. Yeah, they have tons. Just have to be careful that you don't go into like their alien ones, because there's tons of those. There's an idea that the people who authored the Bible were people who Jesus ministered to. Yeah. And the idea that Jesus ministered to fishermen, etc. Oh, I'm high as fucking Ezra workout. Oh my gosh, how did that go, Parrot King? Sarah, check my religion videos channel on Discord also. Oh, yeah. No, exactly. And that's why I'm saying, like, okay, we need to understand, like, okay, how is it that that people understand like the authorship of the Bible, or like what the Bible is. And that's why I've always compared it to like the Death Note, right? It's kind of like they view it as like, oh, once you know of it, then it's like you can't, there's no going back, right? Like there's no, like it's like once you've touched the Bible, it's like now you can't go back to not knowing what the Bible is or whatever it is. But also that it's a complete document, right? That it's already done. And there's also to go on what you said about the ministering, there's also the idea of like being inspired by Christ, right? That it was written as it were, like Jesus also had his hand there, right, on their hand whilst they were writing it, right? So it's like this weird decision to try to make it seem like it's more encased in kind of a theological frame. You have all kinds of videos. I'm going to be watching these all night too. Yeah, they're really interesting to get into. And in fact, I actually once remember I was talking to someone, sort of like these conversations. Actually, let me just switch over to chatting, because, and like at the end, they ended up signing up to go to college, to go to university actually, to study biblical like history and stuff. Like I don't know, like I was just like, they had always had all of these questions. They just never really had someone, I guess, to talk to about. And so, No. No, this is fine. Trust me. I have no notes, right? It's not like I have like notes here and I have like, oh, I'm going to talk about this or that. I usually, think of stuff or remember stuff on the fly anyway. So, like another thing, I'd love to go back to school and learn about history and religion. Exactly. I can listen about it all day. No, that makes a lot of sense. Like, this is why, like, when I tell people that there is this tablet, or this stela, right, that was found, that has essentially the basic stories, using it's a Canaanite stela, right, and it already has, like, Proto-Semitic writing on it, and it details, right, like, essentially the beginnings of what would later become Jewish, like, the Jewish understanding of the world. Right, but it still has the gods like Mat, which means death, right? So a lot of different different gods often just represent a concept, right? But also like their names represent the concepts too, and that's a huge aspect that also doesn't come through in Christianity, because the names themselves don't necessarily mean something, right? Like John, oh, he's just John. Like, there's nothing about John, right? Like so anyway, so it's I can't remember it off the top of my head what it's called, but it's essentially like a story that begins to show how people began to see El, like the god El, as the preeminent god, right, in the Canaanite pantheon, right? And you sort of see this as a pattern that, like, later on it solidifies, where like you see different Canaanite peoples, right, as they start to become more like nations, I guess, as opposed to tribes, to instead, or rather, they begin to encompass tribes, but they are a nation, right? Then they begin to, again, focus on one particular, right? Like, that's why you see, like, the Phoenicians, right? They focus on, X, Y, Z gods, right? But they particularly focus on this one. And when they found Carthage, right? Like, they focus on this one particular god, Baal. But in the Levant, you still have this tradition of, like, well, like, if you go more into what is now Lebanon, right, in the anti-Lebanon mountains, you still see people that still worship multiple gods much longer than in the plains, right, of what is Palestine. There you start to see much more, like, okay, it starts to become more narrower and narrower, where instead those conceptual gods start to just become concepts, right, that are complementary to the god, to the god El, as opposed to, In fact, there's a channel that went over this really well. Esoterica is what they're called, and the person that is the head of that channel is Jewish as well. I just know that off the top of my head because, and so he I think Justin is his name. Justin talks about, Esoterica is great. Because he did a video very recently talking about how the god who's, I think he says oh yes, Lilith, yeah. Lilith is such an interesting thing. I mean, it's such an interesting thing too, because there are some rabbis that, when they have talked about this, have said that there are children that Adam had with Lilith, right? And that they remained in the garden, right? Like, and Mesopotamia. Yeah, exactly. I mean, one thing that really shows how the Jewish, like, what is now considered like the Jewish people, have had their, like, when they lived in Mesopotamia, right? And that they were really part of Babylonian society in particular. What are they doing in the garden? Well, the belief is that, like, they were, is that when they, like, those children, right, because they were born from Lilith, right, that they, like, engage in, I don't know, it's like, it depends, because one rabbi says that, like, oh, like, then they were released, into the world as well, because they were doing unnatural acts, quote unquote, right? And so that's why you have, like, Lilith as a recurring figure in some, Jewish, things, but, and then the kids are more like, like, I've heard one rabbi say that the kids that he had with Lilith, who again was his quote unquote first wife, are the ones that made Cain, like, they're the ones that convinced Cain to kill Abel, right? And that, like, when he goes to the east, it's like that's where they're from, right? Like, oh, because the garden is in the east, right? Like, that's one of the things it says, right? And so that's how they kind of interpreted that, right? Which I found fascinating. I just know that it's not, like, I mean, from what I know, the Orthodox Jewish view, that's not seen as, like, a like, part of theology. That's more, again, of, Yes, I have heard that, yes. Being a class of creatures, yes. And you know who... Right. Well, I mean, because there are two creation stories. So people say, anyway. Or rather, I shouldn't put it like that. That makes it seem like I'm trying to... No. what I'm saying is that most people understand that there are two creation stories in Genesis. Because first Hashem says, and then he created them man and woman, right? And then later, then he brings up, then he saw that Adam was alone and decided to make him go to sleep, take from his side, and make a wife, right? Or a helpmeet is technically what it translates to. Lilith is very memorable to me because of what I got in trouble for asking in church. I mean, it's the same thing, kind of what happened when I asked it in that Jewish studies class, right? It was run by a rabbi, right? And like, again, I have gone to yeshiva, right? I've been in the whole Hasidic, and this was more aimed at like not people that lived like that, like people that weren't raised Orthodox, I guess. But it was like, to just be part of the community. I thought it would be fun, right, to learn about Jewish history. And he was like, no, we're not going to talk about that. Because you're technically not supposed to say her name, right? Like, that's one of the things, too. It's like you're not even supposed to mention that she exists. Which also goes to that idea of being a class of creatures, actually, now thinking about it. Because now I'm thinking, I have heard of that. That Lilith means, like, or rather because it's related to the word for night, that it's like the idea of like why human beings go to sleep at night, and that there's like a different, there are creatures, right, that blah blah blah, that that came to be because of Lilith, right? I mean, I know that there's people that like to argue that. I'm coming. I hope you have a fan on, because there's a breeze. Yeah, essentially, yeah. Oh yeah, I said it 3 times. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I know. What's funny is because I do remember there was this one rabbi who said that like the reason why actually Lilith was so bad was because she didn't want to have sex, and I think to me that's like, wow, so like God first created like the first ace person, like first, right? Like, and that she was all like, no Adam, I don't want to do that, like please put it away, right? And that then Hashem was like, okay, I have to create someone else that's like, not ace, right? And that she was like perfectly fine just staying in the garden, and she's like, oh yeah, I'll just stay here, like I don't want to leave, because that's like a very common joke that ace people will often say, is like, oh yeah, you can just like leave us, in the library or whatever, and go do your, go to your sex dungeon or whatever you want to do. It's always like. Because I remember once there was this person I knew that was ace, and they brought this up, and I'll never forget, because they do sex work, and particularly filmed, right? And so they just remember, I will now away to my sex dungeon. Yes, pretty much. I love that emote. I love that capital idea. That's why I became fascinated with her. I thought I had found a feminist ally that was able to do what she wanted, but no. Well, see, like, it depends. Like, there are people that have tried to like look at her through the lens of a like either because she rejected Adam, right, and that's why she's equated with like nighttime, right, and also implicitly death, right. But also, another thing too is that she represents kind of like this thing that happens with, with Sarah. Since you're in here, Sarah, but like when Sarai becomes Sarah, because in Hebrew, Sarah means princess, right? So it's like Avraham becomes like father. Well, Avraham means, father of many nations, right? But Sarah means princess, right? So you have this like nobility added to her. Pickup story of my life, yeah. So you know that in Hebrew, Sarah means a princess. But there are people that, like, there are feminist Jewish scholars that have read Lilith as a feminist. Like, essentially, like, if I could describe her in one way, it would be like the way how they kind of see her. Let me treat you like one. I love that. I love that. I can impart Sarah-ness upon you, so to speak. But Ms. Frizzle, one of them is looking at the fact that is the idea that she wasn't like that she is a feminist icon, right? Or she is a feminist figure at the very least, right? Because the whole point is that she either because she actually had agency, right? Which is why in the first creation story they're created as it were equally, right? And then in the second one, people can interpret that as like lesser than, so to speak. So I mean, there are ways to think of it in a feminist way. It's just like, again, it either requires you to parse it in the original Hebrew, or it requires you to think of it in more of in the abstract way, right? Like, what does Lilith represent, right? Like, if she's a woman that actually is like, well, what about my needs? What about my, blah blah blah? Then it's very different. That's why I think the like, oh, she didn't want to have sex is just a cope, because it's just I mean, regardless of whether it's quote unquote true, right? Because obviously, we're talking about mythical figures, but the point being that like even if that was quote unquote the case, right? Like that's still agency that a lot of other women in the Bible don't ever get, right? Like it's a very strange thing for a woman, like the first woman to ever have been created, to be like, actually, I don't want this, right? Like, I don't want to live this life, right? And I think, to me, that can be read as that. And that's where I think a lot of feminist scholars have read into it in that way. Because rabbis are because rabbis have been very quick to say, oh, well, obviously there was something wrong about her, right? Like, they want to make it seem like Lilith equals bad, right? And then to equate it with bad. But it's like, again, like in the text itself, it doesn't say anything, so to speak, about her, other than then there's another helpmeet created, right? So a lot of it is informed by the oral tradition, which in Jewish thought was given at the same time. So, right, so like the Torah was given to all of the Jewish people at the same time, but also the oral Torah, right, what is now considered the Talmud, also was given at Mount Sinai. So again, like, that understanding was not something that for most of Jewish history, quote unquote, was known by most people. So so that's one way to also think about that too. But then there's also the connection between her and Hagar and Sarah, right, where you have the birth of Ishmael, right, and then you have Hagar and Ishmael being sent off into like another land, and that's how, and then that's how Islam, right, takes that story and says that that Ishmael is like their descendant from Abraham, right? Because they like, it is understood obviously that there is some connection between the what are, I guess, what we call the Arab peoples, and back then, which were still a tribal society, and the tribal society described in the beginning of the Torah. So like, that recognition of that does kind of make sense. And it's interesting too, because like the Christians don't do that, right? Instead, they have this other figure who has to be the completion of whereas Muhammad and all of that stuff is like, also blah blah blah, this is also going on, right? And there's this other messianism, right? It's like the messianism keeps going, but it's not a fait accompli, right? Like, it's not like with Jesus, right? So it's a very different thing. Which again, I think that I actually haven't seen much scholarship that compares them, but I think, to me, that's where I would try to argue for Lilith as a feminist figure, or at least looking at her through a feminist lens, right? Like, the fact that she had this agency that like Hagar, right? Hagar has, rather that it's the Hagar does everything right, and instead, she's still cast off, right? Whereas Lilith does something quote unquote wrong, right? And she's the one that gets to stay in the garden, right? So I think there's something to that it can be read about that. At a church in Peru, they have a painting of the Last Supper, and there's a potato on the table, and they say the Last Supper had to happen in Peru. What? That makes no sense. Well, like, I will say one thing, like, a lot of the... Yeah, of course, like I said, I'm always down to talk about anything. Like, that's why I'm saying, like, you know, if you guys bring up stuff, I'm always down to just chat. Like, that's not an issue. I've taken the tour, like, 5 times. Oh, that church. I was about to say of the Canaculum. I was like, oh, wow. No, and if you go to Palestine, if you go to OMG, we gotta go if you come to Peru in the catacombs. Well, so there's this conference that, again, was that happens every 3 years or something like that. And 2 years, I think. And, like, the last time, it was still COVID, right? They still had COVID restrictions. And because it's Latin American stuff. And so it was going to be held in Lima. So, I mean, I mentioned it to you before. That there was, like, something going on. I just have to see if they're going to host it in Lima again. Because I know that last time, or this is the only time it's ever really happened because of the pandemic. But, like, I know that they already had everything set up to have it in Peru. So... I don't know if they're gonna, like, just have it again, right? They didn't have it, so to speak, right? Like, if they're gonna decide to just keep it in Peru one more time and then move on, because then they always move on to some other, like, one thing I never liked is that they do this weird pattern of, like, they will go to Latin America once and then they'll be in the United States like 10 times. So I mean, maybe not 10, but like 3 in a row, right? It's like 3 places in the United States, and then they'll go to Latin America once again, and then there'll be like 1 in England, 1 in Spain, and then 1 in New York, and then they'll go back to, you know, it's like Latin America is always an afterthought, right? Like, oh yeah, like we have to recognize we have to go there to that landmass, right? Because that's what we're talking about, right? But it's always like the one that gets the least attention. I don't really have any desire to go to Europe. I mean, like, I have to say that, like, you know, the people that idealize Europe, I mean, another thing is, like, all of our schooling in public schooling is literally made to idealize Europe as if it's, like, literally, like, I don't know, like civilization built at on the gates of heaven or something, right? Like, that's essentially how they try to make it seem. I mean, that's the best way how I could describe it, right? Like, Europe is seen as somehow, like, inherently good, right? And of course that's because that's like back justification for the United States, right? For their white supremacy. But it's this like really weird thing I never quite understood. Central and South America has all the plants I want to see. Right. I mean, like, literal fairy tale kingdom. Yes, Yokio, literally. I mean, I remember being reading, and this person who like well, I mean, this is kind of a sad story, but it's like there was this wonderful bookstore, and I've always wanted to have a quote unquote like relationship with like a bookstore in this sense, like where like I can send them, you know, my request, and then they send it to me, and like once they get to know me, they already know, like, oh, we held some books for you, and blah, blah. Like, that doesn't really happen anymore. In Mexico, I found that that can still happen. It's just that it's just different, right? Like, it's not the same. Because, obviously, it's just different, right? And the reason why I say it's different is because it's really hard to send things over to the U.S. from Mexico, and I hate that. For some reason, Mexico, like, when you send stuff over, you have to, like, add in the tax of them sending it over, so you have to, like, contact them first, and it's just a mess anyway. But yes, I mean, like, France is seen as, like, you know, oh, it's this perfect place where, like, you know, like even in the, like, even when it comes to, like, the riots, right? It's like, oh, like, these people are, like, destroying this, like, perfect, like, pastel colored place, right? And it's like, no, you know, like, it's not like that. Germany is not this, you know, perfectly ordered, everyone knows, you know. Like, I mean, it goes back to this idea that, like, the stereotypes, like, the British had of continental Europeans, like, America took that and just, like, expanded on it and made it even more because they don't have to interact with them as much, right? Like, it's like, you know, because you can't just travel to Europe as easily, right? Like, it's not as easy as if you were British, for example. And so, I've always noticed that. I mean, it's the same reason why I like the Hispanophobic or anti-Spanish views of England mapped so easily onto the onto those that America has with New Spain, quote unquote, and then now Mexico. Like the idea of a man sleeping with a hat, um, and a and sleeping, and then there's like a donkey. Like that used to be like what that's how Britain used to view Spain, right? Because that's how they view the Spanish, right? They live in a hot country that's rocky and mountainous, and they're very lazy, and they always have burros, like wherever they are, right? And that just isn't the case, obviously. But then America took that, and it's like that's what it wants to see when it goes there, right? Like that's a big problem when people visit Mexico, is like they feel like you have to be presented with the real Mexico that they've been fed all of their lives to expect, right? I feel it's the same way in any country, but I especially feel it when it comes to Mexico, because it is a country Americans go to a lot, right? Like they want Mexican people to behave the way how the stereotypes say we do, right? Um, so, there's a huge problem with that, of course, but Americans tend to only go to certain. Yeah, exactly. Like it's usually like places that were built for, as it were, tourism, right? Like Cancun. Like I hate Cabo. I have to admit, like when I went there, I'm like, I don't know what people are talking about when they act like this is like. It literally was so boring because everything was just like, in my opinion, of course, like for me, like there was no like culture, right? Like there was no like I literally had to get on a bus and go really far away from. Oh, I'll be right back. I have to answer this call right now. Hello. Let's see here. I've never been, but my grandpa used to go once or twice a year. And such in the States and get like 5 suitcases full of him to bring. Oh my gosh. He slept in a tent. I have a picture of an alligator blocking him from leaving the tent. Where was this? Oh, to Belize. Okay, that's cool. Now that I'm older, I'm wondering if you had a second family there or something. Oh my gosh. No, like, so yeah, like, when people go to Mexico, like, they tend to go to these places. And again, what's so funny is, like, they go there and want the people to behave like how they expect them to, right? Like, and then of course, because it's a tourist place, they will do it, right? Like, they will oblige, and then that kind of like furthers the issue. But it's obviously not the workers' fault, right? It's the imperialist tourists, right? But yeah, it's just this very weird thing where I've just been like, it's kind of like when I was walking in Mexico City and I noticed that like people were holding hands, like queer couples were holding hands, and it was like completely normal, right? Like, it wasn't like, whereas like I feel like in like like I feel like even if you go to vacation in places in America, like there's always this kind of weird like homophobic or queer phobic kind of expectations for you to not ever show affection, even if it's something as simple as holding hands. And I don't know why that is, but it's just like this very strange, like overarching type of thing, right? That's just always present. But I can't really explain it, right? Like I just feel it. Like, I know that if I do that, it's like then people are going to treat you differently or blah, blah. But like in Mexico, I've never seen anybody be treated like differently necessarily because they were holding hands with their boyfriend or whatever. Like, it just, whatever. But again, also the openness of people to do that is just very different because people don't expect, because there's this view that like, oh, quote unquote, third world countries, countries like Mexico or whatever in Africa, etc., like they have to be like more socially conservative, or because that's kind of part of the grift, I would say, of right wingers in America. It's like they like to be like, oh well, this place is so horrible, right? Like that's always what they do, even though it's not true. But they do that to like feed into the racist impulses that are kind of like ingrained into your education, right? That they want you to expect that something is the case, right? So like when it came to like, is it Uganda with their laws, and then like forget who said it. Oh yeah, I remember, it was Quick. Quick said that he would invade Uganda for if they were to putting those laws into place, right? It's like in that horrible debate about U.S. hegemony, and I'm just like, what? It's like, no, the people have the lobbyists that are from the U.S., the far right evangelicals that are there pushing this stuff. They're the ones that need to be not Ugandans, right? Like, but anyway, it's like it's a very common thing. Same thing with like, again in Mexico, it's like there's this assumed, like, I mean, it's the same thing with like immigrants, right? It's like, that is to say, like the people that they see as like illegal, there's this presumed like cisness and heterosexuality, right? My grandma used to hate me going to Seattle by myself so much. It's dangerous. Like, I live in Houston. Excuse me. What? It's always like that. It's always this like, oh, if you go to this like, I mean, I used to live in South Central, right? Like, in LA, I used to live in like Compton. So, like, when people are kind of like people that know what life is there, what life like that is like there is like, they know that like when white people are like, oh my gosh, that's so scary. It's like, what are you talking about? It's like if anything, like, it's having grown up in places like that, and in Mexico too, like, that make it so that it's like it's impossible to not be a leftist. Like, it's impossible. Like being a liberal is like something that only rich people can afford to do, pretty much in Mexico, because otherwise it's like, why would you even like, there's like the social safety net is so threadbare in so many places around the world, if it's even there at all, right? That for people to be like, oh yeah, like let's go to them with our enlightened centrist views, right? Like, they don't want that. Obviously, if you go to this place where people may be different, it will be dangerous. I mean, there's always that, and also the place that it's also this belief that like wherever there is more acceptance of different people, that it must equate to like to higher rates of crime or things like that. It's like this really weird thing. It's like, you know, like I mean, it's like how there are, you know, it's like how people think of New York, right? It's like people think like, oh, New York is super dangerous. Like, yeah, in terms of numbers, because New York has 23 million people living all the way, you know, in the tri-state area, right? All connected to it. So that makes it seem dangerous, but it's not because of anything like inherent to New York. In fact, quite the opposite. Like there are places in, you know, very white southern areas, like in northern Mississippi, that are you know, very essentially all white, you know, for the most part, and they have higher crime rates than New York City. But that's not what they care about, right? Like it's not about crime. It's about the idea of criminality, right? And how it's used to justify white supremacy, right? That's what it's always about. Like, because they want to equate, oh, people from other countries, people from a different, you know, gender identifications, people live blah, 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 right? Anything that there's any difference that is away from the cis heteronormative patriarchal like Anglo vision of what people should be, is some kind of deviation, right? Some kind of and that the more you deviate, quote unquote, from it, right, that the more you the more criminality or the more whatever it might be, like you must take part in that, or you know, whatever. And it's like that doesn't even make sense. Like that has never made sense. Like it's the same thing when I see stupid videos that are like looking at Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and will say like, how come this one is more poor than that one? And it's just like, one, you don't understand imperialism because they're both imperialized. It's just that the idea of a slave rebellion that was successful enough to build a nation, right, a country in the Americas, was super dangerous, and still is for all of the settler colonial states in the Americas. That's why it's in their interest for the bourgeoisie to keep, in particular, of the U.S., but also you know, Canada, etc., right, to keep, you know, Haiti in this like depressed economically, socially state. Something about oil money brings a lot of problems. Yeah, I mean, there's that too. I mean, like, yeah, Midland, Odessa, and that's like really, really white. Like, I actually used to know. I mean, I knew a lot of people that were from that area. Like, I knew lots of people that were from like Plano, that were from Midland, Odessa, that were from like Abilene, and then like going up towards Lubbock and all that stuff. Like, I mean, there's just like, you know, like I just like the belief that somehow, like, it's kind of like I told my friend the other day, was like so they live kind of like going out into like the suburb, like I say suburbs, but it's like 5 suburbs deep now, like away from what were the suburbs of LA at one point. So it's like, you know, it's practically like in, you know, in Colorado at this point. But anyway, we were this new development because you know, they're like, those developments are the cheaper ones, right? Like if you're willing to live like an hour and a half away from where you work and commute in every single day, then, you know, it's cheaper. And so we went there, and I just kept noting that like there's nothing here for kids to do, like of any age. Like yes, they like all of the parks, which this to me was very weird. All of the parks that they had belonged back. So what are we on? Oh, I'm talking about kind of like I guess like political geography, I guess is one way of thinking of that. So a lot of people know, a lot of those people I know from out there got money from working in the field. They spend it all on drugs so they can keep working more and making more money, and it doesn't last forever. I mean, not only that too, but also like the work itself is very very harsh on the body, right? Like people forget that. Like sometimes people will become addicted to substances, not out of this like, oh, just recreational use, right? As you know, because they always try to tie everything that, whether or not it's like recreational as, say, the common definition of what recreational would be, and to what like the medical or the social definition might be. But you know, like some people will end up getting on opioids because, you know, they've been working, like they work really long shifts, you know, doing really, you know, this is why like truckers end up, you know, getting, you know, become, are like the one of the people that are most likely to what drug is that? They're the most likely to buy like Adderall, right? Like Addies, right? Like uppers to, so then that way they can stay awake while they're driving, because they get paid like 18 cents a mile or whatever. I forget how much it is, or 10 cents a mile or whatever it might be, right? But the point is that like that makes people take unnaturally long truck trips, right? Where they're driving for so long and they can't sleep, right? It's like they don't even think about the human circadian cycle, right? Like and someone's need to sleep. No, instead they're just like, well, you have to get it to this side of the country before this time, otherwise, you know, it takes away from your pay. Yeah, or worse, less regulated things like modafinil and gas station pills. Oh yeah, like those are just bad. Like just don't even. Oh gosh, those are just really really bad. I mean, from what I've seen, it leads. I mean, like it's a. Those have actually, if anything, those are real interesting gateways to. I mean, well now I use that term when I guess I don't mean it like that, but it's like, I guess in a sense I do mean it like that, but also it's like, again, because it's less regulated, right? Then people start to search for stuff that could give them more of that, right? And that's why that's why you see the abuse of controlled substances like that by truckers, right? And it's like most truckers are white and, you know, working class men, right? Cis men, right? So it's like this belief that it's like racialized, right? Doesn't make sense, because then that would make the biggest consumers of illegal substances and controlled substances would be white men, cis white men, you know, and that isn't something that people really want to admit. Like they want to see it as a systemic. Well, it's like Omi and Winnett and other scholars have said. Anytime you see people saying, "Oh, it's a problem of culture," right? That's essentially the move that they made in the 70s and the 80s to try to couch racial difference, right? And instead make it sound different, right, by calling it cultural difference. But it's a euphemism for racial difference, right? Yeah, but it's so common for guys in the oil field to take Adderall for long shifts, then take opioid. Exactly. I mean, like, there are so many, again, like, even with sleeping pills, because, again, like, if you're, with so many different things, I mean, like, there are so many things that people have to do because, you know, the work conditions are not, and then also it's contractual, right? Like it's not like, oh, like, truck, like, there could be a union for truck drivers, right? But a lot of their work is contractual, and that's the issue. Like, that's where, like, adjunct professors, for example, like, it's very difficult to get adjuncts to be in a union because their work is contractual. So, like, they can rescind the contract for the next year if they don't, you know, if they see that you want to get more job security, right? They will take away the job that you already have. It's insecure. They will take it away, right? And they will say, oh, it's because we don't need you, right? And they can always make an excuse, and, you know, obviously the school will believe them. But that's like one of the things that they do with adjuncts. As soon as they find out they're in unions, is try to find out ways to, oh, well, you know, this one student said on your, you know, teaching evaluation that you give too much homework, so, you know, we're not going to renew your contract, which is just bullshit. But yeah, exactly. Like, again, this is why, like, when you see, like, Lindsey Graham and other people saying, like, we have to invade Mexico to stop the drug trade or whatever, it's like, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, Mexico is not even, like, a country, so to speak, as it were. Like, it's not, it has become, okay, bye to dad, good night, hope you have a good rest. It's not even as though, like, Mexico is a country of necessarily of consumption. It has become one over time. But, like, even in the 80s, it still wasn't one. It's always been a transit country. So it's like, it's punishing the fact that, you know, Americans' demand for drugs has gone off, you know, has gone so high that, like, now you have, you know, these laboratories in northern Mexico or whatever, having to make the drugs so that way they can, blah blah blah. But it's not like, it's not a systemic analysis. White folks will get whatever. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's never like, instead of, again, it's always it's like attacking sex workers and not abusive Johns, for example, right? It's like, it doesn't make any sense to go against sex workers. It makes no sense. Like, it doesn't matter what you think about whatever. It's like, there's no reason to blame the sex worker, right? There's no reason to blame the person that has no other choice than to, take, these capsules in plastic of drugs so that way they can take it across, because now the price for crossing the border is so high that the only way they can do it is if they're willing to literally put their lives in danger. Because if even one of those things is eaten by your stomach acid, like, you will just, it's over, right? I mean, like unless they can get them out, right? Unless people know, which again is you having to tell the officers that you did it, and then they still want to charge you as if you are doing something, right? So again, it's not actually, they're looking the wrong direction, so to speak. Like, because like a lot of these people are like women with children, right? That's like, trust me, they're not I just remember this one case, because it was a woman that was crossing with children, which is why she, the amount that she took was very high, and that she started to have stomach pain, and she didn't want to tell the officers, but eventually they figured it out, right? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, she, on one hand, I understand why she doesn't want to tell, because now, if she says it, she's admitted to, quote unquote, committing a crime, right? And so it's like, she's going to be taken away from her children, which is exactly what she didn't want to happen. Like, that was the whole point of coming to America, was so that you wouldn't have her children taken away from her. Yeah, exactly, and the kids, right? Like she left El Salvador, or I think it was, or Honduras, I can't remember. I think it was El Salvador. But essentially she's saying, like, over there, they were kidnapped, but whatever, blah, 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 it doesn't really matter, right? But they wanted to seek asylum in America, but America doesn't, believe asylum exists unless you're white, pretty much. And so, oh, wait, I'm getting another call. I'll be right back. Okay, so let me see here. But yeah, it's like exactly what she doesn't want to happen happens, right? Like, now what's gonna happen to her children, right? I don't know. Okay, so I have to go. Let's see. We have to go do something. So we're going to raid. We're gonna raid No Common Chick. Make sure to tell her that I'll be there very soon. Make sure to get in the robot. And we're gonna go there. Make sure to send lots of meows. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay, let's go.